Diane, if you want to start recording. Thank you.
We're on that wildlife thing. I gotta do an intro.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the 8th Annual Wildlife Hazard Workshop with the Hawaii Department of Transportation and Wildlife Services. This morning we have Ross Higashi here to do an intro. He wasn't able to join us yesterday morning, but he is the Deputy Director of Airports. So welcome, Ross. Good morning.
Good morning, aloha everyone, and thank you all for your attendance this morning. And thank you to the guest speakers for being here to share your knowledge and experiences. And also thank you, Chief Jacobs. Every year you take your special time out to help organize this on behalf of the Airports Division. I really appreciate your time and efforts. We are here to learn from the speakers, again, from their knowledges and experiences that they went through.
Challenges when getting their research.
And for years, I just want to share this with you folks that we struggle with the Nene geese issues. And now I traveled out to Maui over the last couple of months, and Marvin took me around and shared with me the deer, access deer issues. And I heard yesterday, I'm sorry that I couldn't be there, but we do have some options and some plans for that issue. It is becoming another concern for us around our airport system, especially in Maui. And, you know, I just want to reiterate that every quarter we do have meetings, and that's a good thing so that we keep on top of things. But I just want to say that the daily topic today is the pandemic. Everybody probably logs in to see how many cases we had, but I just want to tell you that here we got a job and a duty to perform, and we need to remain focused on wildlife issues and keep on top of it. And of course, as I always have said in other annual meetings, that our main goal is to keep our traveling public safe, including our stakeholders. So again, mahalo for you guys' time, your efforts. I know it's taking out from your daily duties. And when you go back to your desk, you got a whole pile of work to take care of. But this is super important because we got to keep our airport safe and sound. Thank you. Over. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you so much, Ross.
You're welcome.
Next, to give an introduction, we have the State Director of Wildlife Services Hawaii, Darren Phelps.
Thanks, Chanel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Darren Phelps. I'm the State Director for Wildlife Services Hawaii. I'd like to thank everyone for coming back for the second day of our 8th Annual Wildlife Workshop. I'd like to start off with recognizing a few individuals. And the first is the Hawaii Department of Transportation. Without them, this workshop would not exist. They have graciously put on this event for 8 straight years. Prior to the last 2, they held this at their conference room. And those are great events where many of us got to network and plan and discuss just endless amounts of issues and struggles. And so it's been successful. And I think the key to that has been Chief Jacobs and especially Tanya Sakamoto with their outstanding, consistent commitment to airports, human health and safety, wildlife issues, as well as conservation issues. This has come so far from the beginning, from its inception. So a big thanks to them. I'd also like to thank Ross Higashi and Jay Pute for their continued support of this workshop. Without them, a lot of this would not be possible. As you've heard, they have a lot of areas of responsibility, which supports the biggest industry in the state of Hawaii. So trying to juggle all that and then taking their time to be on these workshops, we're truly appreciative of that. Janelle Sharhag, I'd like to thank her for setting this whole workshop up, contacting presenters, getting the word out, getting the agenda. She's just played such an integral part of this whole workshop, and she's put in so much time and effort. Her communication is top notch. She's trying to make sure this thing runs as smoothly as possible. So thank you, Janelle, for your extraordinary efforts. I'd also like to thank Kenneth Hill and Kyan Lewis for their key support, especially for me, being that I have fat fingers and computer literacy that is probably a decade behind most people. So truly thank you for guiding us through these virtual conferences or this type of technology. And last but not least, all the speakers who have graciously given their time and effort to put presentations together. The information and their expertise is truly invaluable to all that are attending. And wanted to just touch back upon the workshop itself. As I was driving in this morning, remembering all those other workshops, and given the struggles of this COVID pandemic, we've managed to still come together. And it's amazing that we don't normally think of airports as having so much wildlife or conservation issues tied in. But as we can see, the many areas that branch off, a lot of our work crosses paths with our different areas, our subject matters. And I would like to ask and encourage and hope that we continue our efforts to build bridges, to work with each other, because no one entity can solve all these wildlife or conservation issues by themselves. No one has a large enough budget. No one has enough resources. So the more we can combine our efforts and resources, if we can find common ground where we can help each other to mitigate, or in native species concerns that we can help preserve or perpetuate their survival. And although not all our work aligns, it in the end it does. I think all of us are in our line of work because we truly care about Hawaii. We have different areas, but it's for the greater good of Hawaii. And so thank you again for all being here, and thank you for those that are helping to make this such a great event. And one last person I wanted to recognize that I see has jumped on is my predecessor, Craig Clark. He was the mastermind behind the Okawala project. And without his tenacity, his commitment, I'm not sure if any of that work would have gotten done. And it's resulted in a very prestigious award, and the recognition is really due to him. And so Craig Clark, if you can hear me, if you're listening, thank you for that. And if we could spare a few moments, Craig, would you mind saying hello to everyone? Because I'm sure everybody would like to hear from you.
Okay, I'm going to try to unmute Craig. So Craig, you should get a prompt that says unmute. And
Okay.
so,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Hey, I had an appointment earlier, so I got on a little late. So I missed some of your beginning remarks, I guess, but but yeah, this has been it was pretty amazing actually having us be able to be in contention for that award and then actually win it. I'd never heard of it before actually, but it just goes to show that if everybody has a focus and a drive to try to figure something out. I mean, try to solve one of the problems that we can see there on the resort and human health and safety issues. We can get anything done, really. And I'm retired, so I don't have much to add into it here. But I'm glad to see that Darren's carrying on and the wildlife workshop is still going strong. And I just wanted to say thanks to the chief and HDOT airports for funding us so that we could actually get that work done. Now, that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Craig. And I apologize. I didn't give you a heads up. I was going to do that. I wasn't sure if you're going to be on today. And so once I saw your name, but it's great to hear from you. And if anybody else wants to reach out to Craig, there's a chat box. I'm sure he's living it up. And yeah, thank you, Craig. And back to you, Janelle.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you and welcome back, everyone. We have another great lineup of speakers today. For those of you that weren't here yesterday, again, my name is Janelle Sharhag, and I am an airport wildlife biologist with Wildlife Services. I'll be acting as the moderator for today. And to start us off this morning, we have Jason Koger, a wildlife biologist with Wildlife Services National Airport Wildlife Hazard Management Program. The program assists the work Wildlife Services provides to airports across the country. Jason has been with Wildlife Services for nearly 12 years and with the airports program for almost 5. This morning, he's going to talk to us about incorporating geospatial data into airport wildlife hazard management and how that can enhance our ability to solve wildlife issues. Welcome, Jason. You can unmute and turn on your camera, and then you'll be able to share your screen.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. Much appreciated. When I present my screen here, I'm going to go ahead and shut off the video just to prevent any freeze-ups, and then I'll catch everyone on the back end for any questions. So again, thanks, and we'll get started. Janelle, what are you seeing right now, the main screen or the?
I see your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, again, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of us Eastern time. Today, I'm going to talk about enhanced management of wildlife hazards using geospatial technology. So real quick, give you an outline of today's talk. I'm going to give a brief background of how the Airport Wildlife Hazard Program serves the airport community. Talk about how we're using the Survey 123 app for collecting airport wildlife hazard monitoring data. Discuss data sharing with cooperators and stakeholders that's currently happening now. And then wrap it up with this collaborative GIS project that we've been working with the University of Maryland Capstone Seniors with, along with USDA Farm Production and Conservation Business Center. More of that to come. So real quick from this slide, you can see that we provide a lot of service to airports right across the country. And you just get an idea of, where we provide that service and kind of how we provide it. And really when we do that, we're providing this federal leadership, right, to resolve these human wildlife conflicts. And in our case with airports, to reduce damaging wildlife strikes for our civil military airport cooperators. When we do this, we usually take an integrated wildlife damage management approach, right? Where at the bottom right, we start off with habitat modification, eliminating attractants, et cetera, excluding them from those areas with harassment, capture and relocation, and last but not least, lethal removal if need be. Now, a lot of times what we try to do while we follow that set of processes is basically identify these habitats, these attractants, if you will, that species like to find themselves on our airfields. Because again, habitat is mainly based up of food, water, and cover. So to kind of identify those locations where wildlife likes to be on our airfields, we're using this Survey 123 app, as you can see here on the right. And that gives us the ability to standardize this data collection across all of the airports that we assist. We can readily access that data. We can share it with cooperators and stakeholders a lot easier. And really the biggest selling point is we can now begin to see it to believe it, you know, especially as wildlife managers on airfields. You know, we know what's going on, but be able to visualize it and tell that story to our cooperators is just really huge. Mobile spatial spatial data collection is important because it can identify those hazards, right? Whether they're the species themselves or those habitat attractant relationships that are occurring. We can prioritize our management recommendations, right? So that our cooperators and stakeholders can better allocate those resources needed. And really, it just gives us more informed decisions, which saves us money, right? Or better yet, money well spent, right? Here's a quick map of where we kind of are with the deployment of that app, collecting that survey data across the country and you see the world. This is a little bit outdated. We're at about 200 some users now. And you can see, you know, other countries that we're doing that, and that's because our, you know, OCONUS efforts have increased with recent hires in Sicily, as well as then in Germany and Africa. This is a quick screenshot of how we're utilizing these web maps and web applications to bring in our data, to filter it per state, to do some quality assurance, quality control on that data before we share it with our cooperators. And this is an example of how, you know, we're using that survey data coupled with other things to basically, you know, take care of these management recommendations, make them actionable. So here's a quick case study of how we've taken a 12-month assessment of spatial survey data. We coupled that with recent publications on quantifying species risk. Now, the risk model you hear that's published here on the left, that was a civil model. And we were able to take military hazard scores that I just don't have a screenshot of that were also published to basically do this risk assessment, if you will, for Buckley Air Force Base. And from that, what we found was, okay, there are issues with waterfowl, especially Canada geese. There was some damaging strikes. Where are these geese? As you see on the map, they're up at this Lake Williams, they call it. And through the years, it was really difficult to have that lake removed. But now, again, with bringing in the survey data, bringing in this concept of species risk modeling, we're able to convey the message of, hey, how important it will be to remove that lake. And as you see from this example, we were successful in those efforts. So we can tell folks when we're training them, hey, you know, we might not be able to move mountains or islands, unfortunately, but we can move lakes. What we're finding is now that if you build it, they will come. And our cooperators and stakeholders are privy to this information and the deployment that we're trying to do, not just with survey data, but other field data that we want to collect spatially. And we're working with the Navy to basically integrate this data into their GIS data model, as well as working with the Air Force that's leveraging a current agreement with Civil Engineering Center, as well as CIML, Colorado State University's Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands, a lot of acronyms, to basically start producing these Air Force BASH dashboards. And what I'm calling are dashboards, where we can visualize our data, which we can do as managers, but now it gives the keys to the car, so to speak, to the rest of the village at a particular airport. So they can kind of see what's going on, filter it, as they want. And now this is just built with survey data right now, but the hope is to integrate other data sets into this. So we have basically just kind of a complete picture of everything that's, related to BASH or that could affect BASH. Things such as pre and post monitoring of management recommendations, as you see in this far left picture, where we had 12 months of pre-data collection, if you will, or pre-management. And then after a management recommendation is action, which in this case, rodenticide, we go out there, we monitor the airfield again for another 12 months, and we see if there's any difference from what we just did. Are there less birds, less strikes because of a treatment, mowing, you name it? It becomes really important in this whole concept to think about how can we visualize and map wildlife strikes. And we've done that a little bit at some airports based on, information from strike reports such as found near distance remaining markers or taxiway connectors, things like that. And as well as other issues, right? Fence inspections, not only important for us as wildlife managers, but also for just the general security of your airfield, right? I'm not sure if there's any certain inspectors on the call, but the idea is to have, this one-stop shop, so to speak, for folks to come and visualize, kind of what's going on with your wildlife hazard story at your airport. Here's just another example of how we could put in habitat management data. Again, this could be mowing or any type of treatments that are occurring on your airfields. Where at one of the Air Force bases, they basically mapped star thistle. Star thistle was growing up on the airfields. It would go to seed. A lot of the songbirds were foraging on it, and that would cause, strikes to our Air Force aircraft. So over the last few years, we slowly mapped that, provided the data to the Air Force. They were able to go out and spray. And over the course of the years, we've had that knocked back to about half the size it originally was, just by communicating it and visualizing, hey, what's going on? Where is the star thistle on the airfield that's presenting an attractant for some of these birds? We also want to begin to incorporate things like the Navy's bird mitigation zones, as well as then other airport spatial data layers from the FAA's airport GIS system. And you can see here just various files that you might get from an airport. This one in particular is Denver International. Last part of this talk, I wanted to brief you on this project with University of Maryland's Environmental Science and Policy Capstone Program. This occurred last spring semester. And basically, we wanted to understand, how does land use change relate to Baltimore's wildlife strike risk trends using high resolution land cover, right? And traditionally, we can get these land cover data sets, as you see on the far left, and they're 30-meter resolutions. And what we are able to do is basically make 1-meter resolution land cover data to do this analysis. So you might say, well, why land use? Why land cover? Well, we know from previous investigations in this publication that there is an effect of land cover, right? With airports like you see here, the map A, where it's ubiquitous land cover, there is a less effect, a less negative effect on flight, less damaging, however you want to put it, versus areas that have a more heterogeneous landscape, more fragmented, right? A lot more edge happening. There's more of a damaging effect or negative effect on flight from these species. And that's a lot to do with, this urbanization towards our airfields. And that brings those urban generalist species, things like starlings, mynas, right? Pigeons, as you see in this far left where the F-16 ingested, geese. And again, it all goes back to that habitat management, right? The very first thing as managers that we need to do to make that habitat less attractant, to eliminate the likelihood of that species even occurring there. So again, I'm going to bring back in that Buckley case study, because basically we did the same thing with risk. And I just wanted to, mention that risk is that likelihood times the severity. So to get likelihood, we use strike databases, whether the FAA wildlife strike database for civil locations, we filter out just for a particular airport. and we break it down for species, birds identified to the species level, and then we come up with the severity based on published relative hazard scores. Again, those civil hazard scores are from this paper in 2018 on the bottom left, and we also have military hazard scores, I believe, that were published in 2019. So the next step we had to do to get that high resolution cool land cover is basically, I was fortunate enough to meet this gentleman from USDA FPAC. And they have this tool that can take that 30-meter land cover, as you see on the far left, called the Land Change Analysis Tool, LCAT, couple it with imagery. In this case is the USDA's National Ag Imagery Program, NAEP. We basically do some crazy labeling of that imagery. We run it through Program R, sprinkle a lot of hard math in, and you get that really high resolution land cover data there you see on the far right. I mean, it's night and day on, accurately representing and classifying the habitat, the land use, right, really on the planet. So when we did land use change analyses now, after we had all that high res land cover, you could see that forest roughly stayed the same. Now, I know some of these numbers are hard, but you could see this ribbon chart where what forest did change through those years, it reverted to grassland or to urban, right? Again, urbanization. Now, if you look at grassland, that became either forest, some of it stayed grass, but then again, became urban, and it gets to that urbanization that's happening around BWI, Baltimore Airport. Over that time, we had two different distinct time periods. We had basically a 5-year chunk that we identified to the 2011 LCAT classification using that high-res imagery, and then clumping strikes based on the 2018 imagery in the land use. So over that time, you could see that some species actually increased risk, where other species had a decrease of risk. Now, at a micro, and we'll come back to that. When we honed into the airport, we found that even though that the airport land cover is modified, you could say how that grassland changed, that there was really no % change in overall grassland coverage. Because of where we move a grass and lay down a runway or a concourse, we end up putting more grass in, and you see that with the purple, right? So it was just kind of like a replacement. So what was interesting during that time period, there was a lot of construction happening at BWI, right? There's a new concourse being put right here, and you can see the pictures through this time period I'm talking about. Again, runway extension project through the years. There's where we are. So when we talk about that grassland habitat being constantly having construction, right, as airports are growing, there's constant construction. Even though as managers, we're actively managing those species, there is an increased risk of mourning doves, killdeer, hornlark, swallows, swifts, species that benefit from that construction, right? Bare ground, newly seeded areas, etc. Of that land use change, we've also seen that, okay, greater urbanization, well, we've seen an increased risk of great blue heron and Canada geese. Again, species that we're managing for, but the risk is increasing because the land use surrounding the airport is changing. And then last but not least, we've seen some species that actually had a decline in risk. And that's because those are species we are actively managing. And for whatever reason, we're just having a lot better successes in terms of risk with things like kestrels, starlings, and hawks. So this was purely exploratory. We're going to proceed on and try another airfield.
Together.
Yeah, I'm sorry if somebody could mute their mic. Appreciate it. But in next spring, semester 2022, we're basically going to kind of rinse and repeat that collaborative effort with UMD, and we're going to look at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland. And we're going to start adding more data to it, right? We're going to try to get our hands on management data that we could tie into this, and potential other data sets, whether internal, external, things like eBird, local birding information, the land cover, whatever installation level GIS can help us to kind of develop one of these types of web apps that you see from the Maryland Environmental Resource and Land Info Network, or kind of like that BASH dashboard I presented earlier on the Air Force. If this is something that interests any of you on the call, I'm all ears. Please feel free to talk to Darren and Janelle, and we can definitely circle up and talk about if this is something that's interesting and assessing land cover and strike risk there for Hawaii airports. I want to thank you all again for this opportunity, and at this time I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was fascinating. So again, like yesterday, we have a couple ways to ask questions. You can either raise your hand and I can allow you to unmute, or you can type in the chat box or Q&A. So Jason, I found the construction part that you had mentioned there very interesting. I know we have some construction projects coming up at H&L. And so considering how those might affect wildlife is one of the things that we're doing right now. So I think probably several people on the call can appreciate that.
Yeah, Janelle, I appreciate that. And if you guys have, kind of a case study where you want to look back at again, this was just, exploratory. We're going to, rinse and repeat and see if, in fact, this is occurring at other airfields that are actively going on in construction. But, those of you on the call that work in the field, that occurs. And now we're starting to see that, okay, well, maybe we're on to something here. And I'm interested definitely to hear from you if you guys have some good case studies that we can basically investigate for you.
Can you maybe talk about what some of those attractants are for construction?
Yeah, I think, the big one is just the bare ground, the newly seeded areas, right? The different landscape features that come in with cranes and various things that birds can perch on. Obviously bare ground, right? And the grit that some of these birds need to digest their food, things like that. But I don't really know for certain, right? Until we kind of start repeating this effort and seeing, what exactly kind of shakes out from this.
Great. Okay, just going to check one more time for anyone's hand up. Okay, we do have a question. So from
Yes.
Patrick, are there similar maps being made for Hawaii airports? So Jason, I'm not sure if you can answer that, but I can take a stab. We
Go
are
ahead.
using Survey 123, and we do create risk maps and species observance maps, but we haven't gone into anywhere near the kind of detail that Jason and his crew is able to do. So I think it would be really interesting to see some of those things.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Janelle, right? Because we want to do this across our program. We would like to do this for every airport that we're assisting. It might not be a crazy land cover analysis, but we do want to build these different data files, again, to visualize all this different data sets that could hopefully help our efforts to, mitigate the risk.
Definitely. Okay, I think I'm not seeing any more questions. So thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
And if you could also stop sharing your screen, there's a little red button on top there.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. All right. And with the change of schedule, if someone had seen an early schedule, we had Brian Washburn up, but he needed to be pushed further back. So I will actually be presenting next. And again, my name is Janelle Sharhag, Airport Staff Wildlife Biologist, and I work with HDOT on airport wildlife issues across the state. So let me get my screen sharing here. course, didn't start from the beginning. Quick preview of everything. All right, can you see that okay and hear me? Okay. Okay, so today I am going to be providing a year in review. So highlighting all the things that have happened over the past year, and I guess a little over a year. So we're gonna pretty much go back to the start of the pandemic and highlight some of the major events, highlight the operations and the strikes, and some interesting things that have happened along this very challenging year for us. So we'll talk about, again, the operations and strikes. Specifically, we're going to talk about plovers, and then lots of events that have happened throughout the year involving endangered species, some of the projects we've been doing, and several other things. So this is just kind of a big picture overview of the past year. I won't have time to go into everything or go into the recommendations specifically for everything. But I can take questions about those later. So this is a site we've been used to seeing over this year, you know, near empty planes, empty airports, just a very different situation for us all. And when this started, we weren't sure what to expect in terms of how this would affect wildlife management in airfields. We did know that whether there are 1,000 operations or 100, those aircrafts and passengers still need to be protected from wildlife collisions. But how has that affected what we do? So if we look in terms of nationwide operations and total operations, so these aren't just commercial, so we're talking cargo and everything together, we saw a 22% reduction of operations nationwide. And in Hawaii, we saw an even greater reduction. So total operations in the state. And I see right now that title, it's not from 1985 to 2020. That title is incorrect. That is from, oh, no, it is correct. Sorry, I was thinking I was on a different graph. I apologize. So again, total operations in Hawaii declined 37%. So a greater reduction than the nationwide strikes, nationwide operations, which were 22%. And we would think that, you know, less operations, maybe there will be less problems with wildlife risk and wildlife strikes. So what does the data show us? So nationwide, we did see a strike reduction. So that this is the total number of strikes. And they were down 26% nationwide. Again, the total number of strikes. In Hawaii, we also saw a reduction in the total number of strikes. But we saw a less of a reduction. So we had a 19% reduction in wildlife strikes in the state. But there's two ways we talk about wildlife strikes. So I just told you the total number of strikes, but what's often represented is the strike rate. So the strike rate is how many strikes there are per 10,000 operations. And what that does is give us the ability to compare nationwide based on the number of operations. So here we have the strike rate in the US in blue and the strike rate in Hawaii in orange. So you can see that the nationwide strike rate decreased by 6% and the Hawaii strike rate increased by 28%. And we're going to talk about this more. So we saw an increase in the strike rate at several of the major airfields. We saw it at Honolulu and Hilo and Lihue. We saw a reduction actually in OGG. And we wanted to look a little deeper into this, what was happening, Again, though, to remember the total strike rate increased, but the number of strikes decreased. So when we broke it down by the airport, one of the interesting things we did see is an increase in the percentage of the strikes that involved plovers. You know, and we know this. We know that plovers are one of our biggest issues every year. But at Honolulu and Lihue and Hilo, we did see an increase. Again, this is the percent of all the strikes that involved plovers. And we can talk about some of the reasons right now, and we can speculate. So plovers have always accounted for the majority of the strikes in this state. But what happened over the last year? So there are several things that we can talk about. We do know that at some of these airfields, we had grass cutting equipment down for a while, and that likely played a factor. But what the specialists were seeing were behavioral changes in these birds during the reduced operations. And so plovers are pretty predictable, and we can move them to a safe area and then leave them alone, and hopefully they'll stay there. But what was happening last year is that they were using areas that they were not using previously. There were also areas of the airfield that they used to use that were no longer available to them due to some parked aircraft and other things. And so they were using different areas. They were coming back to areas after we moved them out. Some of these habitat attractants changed. And so it's really difficult to pin down exactly why we had such an increase in plover strikes. But I think all of those things combined, even though we were continually using the same hazing tactics and the methods that we've used for years on these airfields, probably contributed to this increase. Okay, so now we'll talk about some of the big things that have happened on the airports this year. One of our big challenges was that the Hawaii Humane Society stopped accepting feral cats on all islands. It kind of went island by island. You know, first it started on Oahu, I believe, then it was Maui, Big Island, and Kauai. And this presented a problem for our predator trapping efforts because there was no longer a place for us to take them. So after several negotiations and creating procedure and policy, we were able to solve that problem. And now we handle the cats ourselves at the airfields, which was a huge success. Some of the other things that have happened, and I'll be going over these one by one in the next slides, are we had some Nae-Nae issues. We have had that extreme drought on Maui and are still in a Maui drought. We had the Kehi Lagoon mangrove removal. We had several staff changes, both with Wildlife Services and HDOT. And we're still in that biological assessment and some other things I'll go over. So let's start off with the delay of the Hokoala dog purchase. We have Chad Wickham talking about the whole program later today, and that's going to be really interesting. Talk us and the data. But one of our challenges this year was because of COVID, travel was restricted. So we had 2 trained dogs and handlers, Cliff and Caesar, that were working and doing great. But for a full staff, we planned on having 4 dogs and 4 handlers, but we were having a problem getting the travel approved to get the dogs over here, to get the technicians trained. And then there was also some problems with the titer, the vaccinations. But after long story, finally, in late May, we were able to get a full crew. So this was really exciting. So we added John and Noel to the crew, and we now have 4 fully trained dogs and handlers working at the Hokuala Resort. So this was a great success, and we are happy to have them all working here. Another issue we had was, for the first time, we saw nesting of Nene at Lihue Airport. So in December and January, 2 nests were found, and we worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to determine the best course of action. So this is something we did not expect, but that did happen and is likely to happen in the future. So we allowed 1 nest to hatch out. You can see the little ones right there through the brush. And then because of proximity, 1 nest had to be removed. One of the biggest issues and the biggest things we can do to prevent this from happening again is that grass management. So without tall grass, the Nene are not going to be able to construct the kind of nest they want without a lot of vegetation. So one of the best things we can do is to just keep on that grass management, and then we keep hazing them like we've done consistently, especially in that nesting period. A very unfortunate event that happened this year is we had a Nene strike at Kahului. So this is very rare. I believe it's only happened once there before. So in December, Nene carcass was found near runway 2, but we had no reported strike. So we don't know what aircraft hit it, but based on the time it was found, it likely occurred between midnight and 5 a.m. And so we wrote a report, and we made our recommendations. And again, kind of the same things here that we saw with Lihue is grass management and just keeping that hazing during that kind of winter time, November, December, January, where they're trying to nest. And then something we've talked about now several times over the course of yesterday, and we're going to talk about again today, is the axis deer. So particularly on Molokai and Kahului is where we're seeing these issues. So we had an extreme drought condition in 2020, and we're seeing that drought continue this year, although I don't believe it's as extreme. But axis deer do present a high risk on the airfield. So when we think of generally aircraft strikes, we think of birds, but we actually do see a lot of mammal strikes. And this happens when the aircraft are taxiing and when they're taking off and landing. And deer are responsible for 92% of mammal strikes that result in damage. And this damage can be catastrophic. So with the drought, the deer were moving. They were moving in large areas to find food and water. And you know, they were trying to find food beyond that fence in the movement area. So this winter we had 2 AOA entries on Molokai. And you can see just how close they get to the fence. And if they want to, you know, get in that area, they're going to do everything they can. So exploit every hole, exploit every weakness in the fence, if it means that they're not going to starve. So challenging issue, but something we're all working together to try to address. Another big accomplishment this year was the Kehi Lagoon. So this has been a project years in the making, and we have Bryce today talking about this more. So I'm not going to talk about it too much, but just a preview that we were able to remove the cattle egret roosts and the mangroves in the Kehi Lagoon, which was wonderful to finally see. I'll go over some of the staff changes. So Wildlife Services had several staff changes. So one of the big ones was the former Oahu District Supervisor, Philip Howard, moved on. And Bryce, the Assistant District Supervisor, was in acting for a while. And now Barbara Rowe is acting Oahu District Supervisor for now. Trevor Liu, the former Maui District Supervisor, moved into Assistant State Director, which was vacated by now State Director Darren Phelps. I am now currently acting as Maui District Supervisor for a time period. We also had 3 airport specialist changes. Jordan Au, Shelby Pendarvis, Nico Brown all left us, and we were very sad to see them go. But we have 2 new specialists on the way, and Brianna Wida is already currently in place at H&L. HDOT also had some staff changes, and these are not comprehensive, so my apologies for anyone I missed here. But we had Dave Holland, which was the Oahu SMS, moved to a different position within HDOT. And we had Jeffrey Sawyer, the JRF manager. I believe he retired. And an update on the biological assessments. So we talk about this in our quarterly meetings, but for those of you who haven't been attending and just want the update, as background, we do biological assessments to comply with Endangered Species Act, Section 7 consultation. So FAA submits the Part 139 biological assessment. We drafted it, submitted it to by FAA in March. There was a revision comment period, and we're anticipating a biological opinion shortly. Another one is for the general aviation airports, and was also drafted by us and submitted, and we are working on that comment revision period now. Some other notable events. We started a Wildlife Services newsletter. So this is just to keep people updated on what's going on, the major events, commonly asked questions. For the first part of the year, we were doing this monthly, but when we were realizing not much was changing month to month, we are now going to move to a quarterly newsletter. If you are not on this email list and you would like to be, please shoot me an email and I will make sure to add you. Couple other things I'd like to note, just some things that have happened throughout the year. In March, we had some severe ponding at H&L, which attracted some waterfowl, but luckily it did evaporate pretty quickly. So this was kind of the height of the ponding in this photo. We also had some novel species showing up. So we had a juvenile glaucous wing gull. Luckily, it didn't stick around. And then we had a great tail grackle. I know that's kind of a small picture, but it's this black bird with a very long tail, and hasn't been seen very much in Hawaii. So it was an interesting sight. And when we see these kind of novel species, what we do is we make sure we accurately ID them and then check on their status. So we usually talk to Fish and Wildlife and see if there's any concern with the species and talk about how we might address them on the airfield and what we can do. Another interesting thing is we had some goats keep showing up outside of Hilo. Apologize for the aircraft in the background. But District Supervisor Slim was able to find out where they are coming from and work with that owner to address making sure they're not going to get on the airfield. Okay, so I know that was a lot to cover. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to take any questions as soon as I can get back to the screen. Okay. Okay, so I have a question from Steve. Where's the location of the ponding at H&L? So I believe it was, and if John Cody, you're on the call, you can jump in, but I believe it was at the approach end of 4 left. So that area. Not sure if John's on. Okay. All right, thanks, Steve. Any other questions? Okay. All right, with that, I think I will move on to, just checking for hands, no hands up, okay. Great. So we're gonna move on to our next speaker, who we're very excited to have, Amy Anderson, who is a national wildlife biologist for the FAA. Amy is headquartered with the FAA in Washington, D.C., where she writes and interprets national policies and guidelines to reduce wildlife hazards at Part 139 and general aviation airports in the U.S. Today, she's going to provide us with a program update for the FAA. So welcome, Amy. Please turn on your camera and you can unmute and then share.
Hello, thank you. I appreciate the excited part. This has been a really interesting workshop. This is my first time participating in this workshop. Usually it's my colleague, John Weller, and he really enjoys it, but he is on a vacation with his family that was planned for a while. So he asked if I could fill in for him, and of course, I'm happy to do so. Today, I'm going to share my screen here. Of course, I'll never be able to find the one I'm looking for. Here we go. So I'm going to give just a briefing kind of on what the FAA has accomplished, what we've been up to the past year. I have hit the slideshow, so it's going to take a sec. There we go. I'm hoping you all can see the slideshow now.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this was, as you were saying, a very unusual year. But we did get some really great stuff accomplished. And this was one of the things that the FAA spent a lot of time working on when the shutdown first happened last March. And this is what a lot of airports looked like, a lot of parked aircraft, and which presented its own interesting group of problems that we hadn't had to deal with before from the wildlife standpoint. Is, of course, what animals are deciding to use all these parked aircraft as places to nest or roost. Obviously, everything had to be inspected before they could get back out in the air. So this was a big deal. We were running around trying to find places to park all these aircraft. The day with the least air traffic was April 12th, with about 36,000 flights or operations, and the year before that, the highest traffic day was 186,000 airport operations. So it was a huge decrease. And this is what airports looked like. They were empty, which was just so surreal, a very strange sight. And the homeless populations were deciding that airport parking lots and garages were a great place to hang out. So there was another kind of safety issue that the FAA and the airports were having to deal with that we might not have expected initially. So we actually just issued the newest strike report. Just, I think, within the past month. We are very proud, of course, to be putting out the 26th annual strike report. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the highlights in this report. You can access this report on our website. We haven't actually printed out any copies yet, just because it's a little more difficult to do with COVID, and we're not even back to the office yet. We're all still working from home, but you can get the PDF online to take a look at. So in 2020, there was a decline of 33% of strikes reported from the previous year, 11,605 strikes. From March 2019 to 2020, there was a big decrease in passenger travel, and which included obviously both the Part 139 and GA movements. And the strike rate declined about 7%. And actually, just with commercial flights only, it declined less than 1%. And that was only analyzing the data from March 2020 through March through November of 2020. So that was a little less than we expected. We thought there would be a bigger difference in strike rates. In 2020, we held steady at about 4% of damaging strikes. We have been working on this as one of our metrics because we feel that this is a key indicator of wildlife hazard management plans at airports working. The damaging strikes, of course, are the ones we want to decrease. And since 1990, it's declined from when it was 20%. So that was a huge number, and now only 4%, and we're getting a lot more strikes reported. Unfortunately, where the certificated airports are reducing their damaging strikes, the GA aircraft have not been able to do that so far. This photo is actually from the annual strike report, and this damage was caused by a black vulture at 1,100 feet, and it caused substantial damage. So one of our biggest focuses right now is working with the GA airports on how to help them better manage their wildlife and get those strikes, those damaging strikes, reduced. This is just a graphical representation of wildlife strikes per month based on 2019 and 2020. You can see the significant reduction. Dr. Richard LeBeer provides us with the analyses that he conducts from the data from the wildlife strike database. And so he created these graphs for us. We're pretty proud of the improvements that have been made to the National Wildlife Strike Database. It was the result of very hard work of the folks from the USDA and from the FAA Technical Center. We created new software that allows for the strike reports to be vetted and publicly available within 2 to 3 days or even less of the report being submitted. And if you've been around for a while, you know that it used to be 6 months sometimes before you would actually see the vetted report on our website, because we wanted to make sure that the data on the database was accurate. Sometimes we were getting more than one strike report per strike. So all of those had to be manually vetted. And now, thank goodness, we've stepped it up with much better software to have it out to the public within a reasonable amount of time. Also, it's much easier to search for strikes or for a specific airport or airline, and you can do this much easier without having to download the entire database as you had to do previously. So the Airport Cooperative Research Program, or ACRP program, has been around for a long time. The FAA Airports Program funds the research that is conducted. And this year, or currently, we have these 3 ACRP projects in the works. So be looking for these reports to be issued probably within the next year or so. I know we're kind of right in the middle of all of them. So these documents they contain a lot of great information that is evaluated by peers, by the FAA liaisons, by scientists. So it can be very helpful. I think it's for anyone in the aviation industry. So during COVID, there were some things that we had to change. One thing in particular was the annual airport wildlife hazard training, which is required for certificated airports to take place every 12 months. And with everything being locked down and no one being able to travel, airports were still technically required to have that training conducted for any airport personnel involved in the wildlife hazard management plan. So of course, we made an extension available to airports that could not get the training when they were scheduled. And if it was at all possible, virtual training was also made available if possible. So at this time, I know things are getting iffy again right now with the Delta variant, but at this time, there are no additional extensions that we know of on the horizon. But I've seen some amazing virtual training programs that people have put together quickly. The USDA has some private companies with qualified airport wildlife biologists. So that is an option, of course. If there is an issue for airports, then we're just asking them to contact their regional office or their airport cert inspector, and we will definitely work with you. So we want everybody to be safe. And so we want to make sure that if the virtual training or an extension is what you need, then we'll work through it. So the Airports Division and the Tech Center provides funds to cooperative partners every year to do some research, and we're very fortunate to work with exceptional cooperative partners, including USDA, the National Wildlife Research Center in Sandusky. We work with several universities, Mississippi State University, and they have been working on some really great research projects, more than I can do justice to with just a couple of slides, but just so you know kind of what we've been working on. Of course, the UAS is the big up and coming exciting tool, and that there's a lot of focus on determining whether or not it is going to be a tool that can be used at airports for wildlife surveys or hazing. So be looking for some peer-reviewed papers to come out in different journals, things like that. Some examples for UAS usage that would be very helpful is surveying mammals or animals that move during the night, so nocturnal movement, any gull hazing, especially the gulls that nest on buildings near the airports, getting them to be uncomfortable so that they don't keep nesting in those areas is kind of where we're headed using the UAS. And of course, hazing with turkey vultures, things like that. We're also working on developing some risk assessments associated with wildlife and aircraft collisions to help management programs be more efficient and focus their efforts on specific areas of risk. And studying the visual responses of birds to LED lighting. That's been going on for a little while, and we're hoping that this will lead to lighting systems on aircraft that will reduce bird strikes. Also, many studies happening right now with evaluating the success of translocation of Cooper's hawks, great horned owls, and albatross specifically. Many airports use translocation of their raptors, and we're kind of digging a little deeper to determine how successful it is with different species, and if it is going to be an effective tool in the future. Avian radar systems, they're still out there. Not a lot of airports use them at this point, but the FAA has spent a lot of time researching them, and I think that they do have their place at an airport as a tool. And we're actually putting together a manual that can be used by airport sponsors and qualified airport wildlife biologists or operations folks that will hopefully make the avian radar a little more user-friendly and a little less intimidating, I think. So we are getting the help of several different companies that manufacture and use avian radar systems, of airports that have used them, and we're sharing the methodology and how they can best be used at different airports and how they can be best used as tools. And of course, we will continue to offer AIP funding for radar systems. I do understand that they are expensive, and not just every airport can afford to purchase a radar unless they fully know that they're getting their bang for their buck. And that's what we hope to help airports with this manual. We were also approached recently by Fish and Wildlife Service, who own the Midway Atoll Islands. They are looking at using avian radar to survey the nocturnal movements and the populations of the bone and petrel. The bone and petrel populations have increased significantly on the island, and since they fly kind of at that dusk nighttime area, it's a little difficult to survey or see how their movements and patterns are because it's dark, we can't see it. So so the avian radar would be a great tool to try to figure out what their movements are and how they may affect flight schedules at Henderson Field, which is why the FAA is interested, because there is a certificated airport on Midway Island that requires annual inspections and all of the same things as a regular Part 139 airport. And based on research that was done by Dr. Joel Beer, for example, gosh, I think back in like 2006, 2007, they switched their flight schedules to evening. And that was before the bone and petrel population had increased so significantly. So now having this data might help us determine whether or not we need to change the flight schedule again, because we might be flying in there right when the bone and petrels are most active. So we won't know that until we have that data. So the FAA is actually helping to fund the shipment of the avian radar to the island, because that, as you may imagine, that is a very costly and timely ordeal. John and I are very fortunate to be able to do work with many countries and many other bird strike committees. And this past year, we have participated in webinars to assist ICAO Asia Pacific region, or APAC. They are very motivated to develop some new wildlife regulatory guidance. They do understand that they have some airports that have some significant risk, and it's been great to work with them, and we're honored that they ask us to be a part of their development and share all of our lessons learned. So it's because we are certainly interested in ensuring that all international airports are all the airports that Americans or US folks fly to, we want them to be safe from wildlife as well. So it is important that we make sure to reach out and have coordination with our international partners. And every year we are also asked to participate in the Central South American Regional Bird Wildlife Hazard Prevention Committee. It's a very long title, and we usually just call it CARSAMPAF because, as you know, we all love the acronyms and making up our own words. So that is something that we have been involved with for many years, and we presented last year, and we're also on the schedule for this coming December, and it will be virtual again. And I added that picture of the screenshot because I'm sure, like we are today, you're all very familiar with just seeing little thumbnail snapshots of people on these Zoom calls. I personally would much prefer everyone be in person, but at least we get to see everyone's smiling faces, even if it is on our computer screen. A couple other things we're working on that I think is very important for us here in the US as well. ICAO has a strike database, but it needs help. And since we were just able to improve our database here, we are hoping to help them to upgrade their database and make it more accessible for all countries and promote strike reporting for countries all over the world, so that we have the most complete data that we can internationally and not just from the US. And the World Bird Strike Association has an annual meeting, and we also presented virtually for that as well. So that's it. I'd be happy to take any questions. I will stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm really excited to hear about the Midway, the radar use there. That's going to be really interesting.
I think so, and I hope I get a trip back out there just to make sure it's working properly, because I love Midway. I would go there all the time if I could.
I haven't been yet, but maybe someday. Okay, so again, you can type in questions to the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to look for raised hands. I'm not seeing anyone.
Well, if anyone thinks of any questions, please email me or John. My email address is super easy, amy.anderson@faa.gov. And if any issues come up, I'm also happy to help with anything specific, but you guys have a lot. You got the USDA has all the experts are there, so I'm not sure if I could help much more.
We do have one question coming in from Patrick about bat strikes. Are bat strikes also an issue?
They are, but percentage wise, they're only, I don't know, I think about 3%. They're very low, maybe actually 1% maybe, because 97% are birds, and then you've got the mammals like the deer and things, and then bats. So it's a very small percentage of strikes, but we do get them.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you. You guys have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too. Okay, so on to our next speaker. We're going to go back to the subject of access deer. So next up, we have University of Hawaii master's student, Derek Reish. Derek is focused on quantitative ecology for wildlife management. Last year, he presented us with preliminary results from his analysis of axis deer distribution on Maui and is back this year to present the final analysis from his research. Welcome, Derek.
Thanks, Janelle. Thanks for the introduction. Share my screen here. You see that?
I can see your screen, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Not the presentation, yeah.
Oh, you can't see my presentation?
I didn't at first, but now I can.
Okay, perfect, cool. Yeah, so thanks for the invitation to this workshop. I presented last year, like Janelle was saying. I think last year, or was it 2 years ago? Yeah, it was last year. And I think I was a master's student at that point, but I've since graduated and I've stayed on at the University of Hawaii as kind of an ecologist or spatial planner, continuing my master's research on other islands. And today I'll be presenting the distribution. We did a pretty big modeling effort of the distribution of really all ungulates on Maui. But I put axis deer in the title there because I think it was most prevalent to airports and wildlife hazards, but I've also included some of the results from goats and pigs in this presentation. This was kind of a collaborative effort between the University of Hawaii and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, their Division of Forestry and Wildlife. So as previous talks had mentioned, there's a number of ungulates that have been introduced to the islands, and there's various assemblages of these ungulates based on which island you visit. And they were introduced as recently as a few decades ago, and then all the way back to the first arrival of Polynesians with the introduction of pigs. And we have, like I was mentioning, different assemblages of these ungulates. For example, on Kauai, we have the black-tailed deer, which is unique to that island and was introduced in the 60s. We have mouflon sheep on the Big Island and Lanai, and pretty much pigs throughout. So we have these kind of unique assemblages, and it's important to take those into account when kind of looking at any management recommendations, because they each kind of function differently. So the kind of driving question behind this research that we've been doing for really the past 5 years now is kind of this conundrum that state agencies are challenged with. They're kind of mandated to conserve and protect our native ecosystems while at the same time maintaining a viable hunting program. And that kind of comes into conflict with each other when all of our game mammals are introduced and are considered invasive species, and so threaten our native ecosystem. So how do we manage them as a viable hunting resource while at the same time protecting and conserving our native ecosystem? So we wanted to take a spatial approach and look at this issue and look at how we can prioritize these different management actions across the landscape. So this is kind of our problem set here. We have our hunting units, our native forests, and we really wanted to see where these animals are moving across the landscape to kind of make more informed decisions about their management. And so this is kind of our base problem set, but it's also important from the airport's perspective, and I'll show you how it could be important to look at these distributions from kind of a wildlife hazard perspective. So this is the driving questions behind our research, but there's other applications, and that's why I'm presenting at this workshop today. So it's been an ongoing effort since 2015, really, and we started our first field season on Oahu in 2016. And we're currently working, or we just wrapped up our last field season, our most recent field season on Kauai a few months ago. But today I'll just be focusing on the data from Maui because I thought it was most prevalent to this audience. But if you are interested in the results from the other studies, feel free to contact me after, and I'd be happy to share those reports. So at each of those sites that you saw in this map here, all of those red points are research locations that we put out game cameras. And so we put out 6 game cameras at each of those red dots that you saw on the previous map. And we leave them out for 2 weeks, and they capture anything kind of moving across the game camera. They're triggered by movement. And so we get all kinds of data from ungulates to other small mammals like mongoose or cats, and even birds. In addition to doing those kind of game cameras at each of those game camera points, we also do sign surveys for ungulate presence, and that can be anything from pigs digging or rooting to game trails or scat left behind by those animals. And so we use those kind of two data sets to build models and look at relationships between the presence of that data, whether it was a detection of a pig on a game camera or a detection of an axis deer on a game camera, or if we observed pig rooting or we observed a hoof print from a deer. We use those kind of detections and model them with environmental conditions to look at correlations between the detections and various environmental conditions. And using that, we can then model out outside of the areas that we sampled to see what the abundance would be in the areas that we didn't sample. And this is kind of a species distribution modeling approach. And I won't go super into depth right now on this unless you would like afterwards. I can kind of address the more specific species distribution modeling approaches if you're interested afterwards. But basically, we just correlate those detections with environmental conditions, and that allows us to build species distribution models. So this is kind of what our results look like. This is pig distributions on each of the 3 islands that we've done so far. And these are kind of the results from these types of data sets of all that field data correlating with environmental conditions and then predicting outside of the areas that we sampled. And going a little more in depth, this is the pig distribution that we had on Maui, and you can see we predicted pigs to be most abundant in kind of the higher elevation natural areas. That's not to say that they wouldn't be a threat to as a wildlife hazard to the airport or whatnot, but we just found them to be most abundant outside of those areas and more of the natural vegetated areas. And on the left, you can see the kind of environmental conditions that were most significant in predicting their distribution. First was rainfall, vegetation height, vegetation density, and also the distance to forest, which we kind of thought of as kind of a cover component, like they needed that cover, and it was a significant predictor in their distribution. Axis deer is quite a bit different. We found rainfall, vegetation height, and native cover to be significant predictors in their distribution. But you can see from maybe the viewpoint of a lot of people in this workshop, maybe they'd be a little more concerning for airports or even roadways and whatnot in terms of strikes. And if you're familiar with axis deer distributions, you can see that certain areas predicted by our models don't currently have axis deer there. And I know Steve Hess was talking yesterday about kind of population modeling and like looking at the growth rate of axis deer on Maui. And our models kind of indicate that maybe they haven't reached their entire range capacity, because if management wasn't going on and the populations were growing, we could see them potentially on West Maui where they currently aren't there, and maybe even in high abundance around the airport, which might be concerning from most of your viewpoints here. Feral goats, kind of a fairly similar distribution, kind of more in the drier areas as opposed to the deer. But again, we found vegetation density and annual rainfall to be important predictors of the distribution of feral goats. We found them to be vastly abundant around the kind of southeastern side of Maui. And if you're familiar with the geography there, the topography, there's a lot of lava fields and really dry areas over there. And so we found them to be most abundant throughout that kind of habitat on Maui. And so we kind of take a scope out and look at the 3 different distributions. I'm not sure if you can tell by these, but they kind of fit like little puzzle pieces together. Each has their own little niche space. And if we can combine them together, we get a pretty stark picture of all of the introduced mammals on Maui. Pretty much nowhere on Maui is kind of untouched by these introduced mammals. And I mean, from a kind of Department of Transportation viewpoint, I don't really think in that kind of mindset a lot of the time. I think of more of conservation, but from that viewpoint, it could be concerning from animal strikes by cars or by aircraft. I know that car strikes is an issue on Maui with all of the axis deer there. But yeah, it could be kind of a little bit, you take some ease of the concern here, because I think there's a lot of areas, particularly natural areas, that are fenced off. And so a lot of these areas might not show up as red as they would because they're currently fenced off and no ungulates are there. But if there were no fences, this is kind of the scenario that we might be looking at. And so just to kind of wrap things up, implications for management, these kind of distribution models can be used to prioritize where to allocate funds and resources to conserve threatened and endangered species. Again, I think most often in a conservation standpoint, but also if you wanted to take these models and prioritize where there would be most threat to airports or strikes from cars or whatnot, looking from kind of that Department of Transportation perspective, these would be hugely applicable. And in that case, I know there was a talk just half an hour to an hour ago, looking at kind of high resolution spatial data to prioritize how to avoid strikes to aircraft and how to prioritize where to manage across an airport. And this is kind of a similar approach, and where you kind of take a step back and look spatially where these problems are occurring and where you can prioritize your management efforts. A few others that are relevant to conservation and hunting and might not be as much relevant to the airport community, but providing a tool for land acquisition to value potential land based on their benefit to state and federal nonprofit organizations. So if there are a lot of ungulates on the landscape, you might be looking at more management costs to kind of manage those populations than you might have previously anticipated. And maybe that's important from an airport perspective if you're looking at putting in a new airport in an area with dense introduced ungulates there. You might have more of a challenge than you might have thought previously. Minimizing conflict, you can look at spatially how to prioritize both of these management objectives, whether it's for hunting or conservation, and you can look at trade-off areas so that those two management objectives aren't coming in constant conflict with each other. And finally, it wasn't previously known kind of the distribution of these ungulates and the abundance statewide. And so we're kind of developing a baseline, if you will, for those ungulate distributions and abundances across the state. And with that, I will leave it for any questions. Just a big thanks to all of our collaborators. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or send me an email afterwards. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Derek. And I apologize for the mischaracterization of your role. So Derek graduated with his master's in 2019 and is now working for the university. Also, I really appreciate your attempt to make this applicable to the airports and HDOT. I think you presented that very well and tied it in with some of the spatial data Jason was talking about. So we do have a question from, it looks like Patricia. Do changes in agricultural use change where these feral ungulates show up?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't have the kind of, so from a modeling perspective, we have to use kind of detailed spatial data, and we don't have the best data and kind of current data of ongoing changes of fallow agriculture or whatnot. But anecdotally, I would say that fallow agriculture, you do see an increase in abundance in those kind of fallow fields because of the lack of management and the lack of activity going on in those fields. They kind of tend to move into those areas.
Okay. All right, looking for hands up. Any more questions? All right. right. Thank you so much, Derek.
Yeah,
Oh, wait,
thank you.
I got one. So this is from Bill Bukowski, and this is the Wildlife Services District Supervisor. He is hoping to hear about your data on Kauai. So I can connect you two through email if you'd like.
Yeah, of course. So if anybody is interested, we have a state report for Oahu that was written about and published about 2017, and then we had a Maui report come out in 2019, I believe. And I'm currently still working on the Kauai report because we just finished the field season there, and that will be coming out probably in the next 6 months or so. So I will definitely, if anybody's interested, I will send those over once completed.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Derek.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we have one more speaker before we're going to take a brief break. So we have Carmen Antiki, and I apologize if I butchered your last name. Carmen is a wildlife biologist from Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center at the Hawaii Field Station. Carmen's work focuses on developing methods and tools for controlling invasive species across the Pacific. Today, she is going to give us an overview of a new tool that can be used to control the invasive mongoose and intercept their entry to places where they are not currently established, like the island of Kauai. So thank you, Carmen. Welcome.
Thanks, Janelle. Can you hear me and see me?
I can.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. Can you see it?
Yes, I don't see it in presentation mode yet, but I see the presentation.
I think it should load.
There it is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Janelle, and I'm excited to be talking to you guys today. As you said, I'm Carmen. I work for the National Wildlife Research Center at the Hilo, Hawaii Field Station. And today I'm going to share with you guys our field station's work on developing a toxicant for invasive mongoose control. I also have to give a big thank you to my co-authors and staff at the field station who've been working on this research for many years and like way before I started on the project. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to share with you about our invasive mongoose, which most of you guys are familiar with. They were brought over to the Hawaiian Islands in the late 1800s for biocontrol, primarily for rat control on sugarcane fields. And they were brought to the islands of Hawaii, Maui, Molokai, and Oahu. They were unsuccessfully introduced on Kauai, and they were not attempted introduction on Lanai and Niihau. So mongoose are very successful. They now have established populations on the islands they were introduced to, and they have a negative impact on our native ecosystem. They're top predators and predate on many of our native species, which include our nesting water birds and seabirds. They're also a human health issue because they're a carrier of many diseases. This includes leptospirosis here in Hawaii, and also they're a carrier of rabies in other parts of the world, like Puerto Rico. They're also an issue for sanitation because they follow food sources. So they invade areas like food processing facilities, as well as public parks. And they're also an issue for transportation because in the past, there has been incidents of us transporting them from islands where mongoose are occupied to areas where there's mongoose-free islands like Kauai. So these accidental introductions have happened multiple times on Kauai. They usually show up in the airports as well as ports of entry like harbors. So this mongoose are a threat of this accidental introduction and are an issue of biosecurity and transportation here in the Hawaiian Islands. Our traditional control methods for mongoose include live traps, so like this tomahawk trap in the picture, which can be effective for trapping mongoose, but they have high labor demands because they require techs to go into the field every day to check the traps. They only can trap one mongoose at a time, and also require a secondary form of euthanasia once they're trapped. So this could be a CO2 or firearms, which also add costs to this method. An alternative to traps are toxicants, but currently we only have one registered product for use in Hawaii, and that includes is the Ramic minibar, which is a difascinone-based product, first generation anticoagulant, and it is co-labeled with rats and mice. And here in the picture, you can see what the Ramic minibar looks like, and it's a hard grain-based wax block, which can be useful for rodents, but has fairly low palatability for mongoose that has a carnivore diet and require a softer bait to for it to be attracted to them. So these Ramic mini bars have a low palatability and low acceptance with mongoose, but there are only toxicant alternative currently. And in the past, there has been mongoose only registrations in Hawaii, and this included a difascinone product, which was registered for use mixed with freshly ground hamburger meat, that was palatable for mongooses, but it didn't last very long in the field. As you could imagine, this fresh hamburger meat degraded rapidly, and there was also the requirement for personnel to have to make it in the field, so that added a time cost. So that product was discontinued. So right now we only have the Ramic mini bars available, and it presents this need for a new effective toxicant for mongoose control. And so that's where our field station comes into play. And I'm going to share with you the process that the National Wildlife Research Center has been doing to register a new product for mongoose control. And an initial step that we did was evaluate existing toxicants that might be promising for mongoose control. And so the first trial we did was doing a cage trial looking at palatability and toxicity of different candidate bait types and toxicants. And these included the more traditional rodenticides that you can order from manufacturer, as well as different toxicants that are up and coming in research that we mixed with a palatable bait matrix. And so overwhelmingly, we saw that the consumption of these hard rodent products, these waxy grainy block products primarily, had a very low consumption by mongooses. So we need to find an alternative to these rodenticides. As you can see, we trialed out the Ramic mini bars, which is the toxicant that's the only one that's currently registered here, and it had a very low efficacy, only 20% mortality in our cage trial. But that technical difascinone with minced chicken, which was a highly palatable matrix for mongoose, had 100% mortality. So we found out that difascinone is toxic for mongooses, but just in the form of that hard grainy type of bait matrix doesn't work. So with help from our registration unit at the NWRC, we did a evaluation and risk assessment of the 4 candidate toxicants that we thought were the most promising to move forward with registration. And we considered cost. We also looked at non-target risk, toxicity, and humaneness of these toxicants. And overwhelmingly, we found that difascinone was the most promising because it had the lowest cost to registration. The product difascinone has been used for past mongoose toxicants. So the EPA has that data. There's also a lot of pharmacological studies that have been done on diphacinone, and we have good data on its environmental fate. So that was one of the big data gaps we found in the other kinds of toxicants that we analyzed. And also diphacinone has a lower non-target risk because there's a known antidote, which is vitamin K. And we also know that it is highly toxic to mongooses. So now that we had a promising toxicant, we now need to pair that toxicant with a palatable bait matrix. So that was our next step in developing this toxicant. And so we did a cage trial looking at placebo versions of bait matrices that are used in other countries or with other species. And so these included, the first two were Fox Shield and Fox Acute, which are made in Australia for invasive fox control, which is also a carnivore like our mongooses. And these included a soft bait matrix, kind of sausage consistency, and Fox Shield was a fish-based bait, and Fox Acute was a meat-based bait. And we also looked at hog-on placebo, which is also used in Australia, but for feral pig management. And this was also a soft bait matrix that's peanut-based. And lastly, we looked at our pork loaf type of bait that has a spam-like consistency that's being developed for invasive brown tree snake control by the National Wildlife Research Center. So looking at these 4 different types of bait matrices, we found that they all performed fairly well compared to the dry dog kibble, which was the challenge diet in this trial. They all 4 had a high daily consumption by mongooses, and that's very promising. But we also had to consider compatibility with the toxicant, as well as field and storage longevity, as well as if there's an available manufacturer and the convenience in acquiring this bait. And so considering all those things, we went with the Fox Shield because it had a very high consumption, as well as it has a known manufacturer in Australia that can mass produce this bait. And because it's already used in Australia, it has a high field and storage longevity there, and will likely have a long field longevity in Hawaii. So now that we have a selected toxicant and bait matrix, we then can now combine those two and perform a cage trial with this toxicant. And so we worked with that Australian manufacturer, and they developed 2 experimental formulations of this bait that we did an initial preliminary trial with. And we found that the first experimental bait performed slightly better than the second one. There was 100% mortality. And so we went along and chose that one for our final cage efficacy trial with our GLP standards, which stands for Good Laboratory Practices, which is a requirement by the EPA for registration of pesticides. So we're in this more rigorous GLP study, which used more mongooses over a long period of time with control animals, we found that that formulation still was pretty successful. We had an 85% mortality. And so this report is now being sent to regulatory agencies for review. And so now that we have our toxicant, we have to think about how we're going to put this in the field, how we're going to deliver it to the mongooses. And the best way to do so and the safest way to do so is with bait stations. Currently, there is no mongoose targeted bait station. So that is what we're going to work on to develop in the lab and the field. And this mongoose bait station will ideally reduce take from rodents. So, your traditional bait station, which is designed for rodents, we want to modify that a little bit so it isn't taken by rodents, but by mongoose. And then also we want a reduced take by other non-targets and other species in the area, like EO or Nene and our native species. So we also want this to be mongoose accessible and minimize the removal of bait by mongooses and in the environment. As you can imagine, we want to have that bait available in the bait station for as long as possible so we can get all of the mongoose on the landscape. And so the first study we'll do is a cage trial in the lab with the placebo version of the fox shield. And this will tell us if it's mongoose accessible, as well as minimize if it minimizes the removal of bait. And we'll do this with camera traps and video, and to find out which of the our mongoose bait station prototypes is working the best. And once we have a prototype that's working well in the lab, we're going to take it out to the field, and we'll set up bait stations with our placebo fox shield as well. And this will now allow us to see if it reduces take from rodents, mice and rats, as well as reducing the take from other non-targets in the environment. And with this study, we'll be able to put our bait out into the environment without the toxicant, but it will have the same bait matrix. So we'll be able to see how it does, if it's what's the durability and weatherability, is are insects attracted to it and other invertebrates. So we'll do this by monitoring the bait daily, as well as we'll have camera traps on the bait stations. And before we can move on to putting our toxicant in the environment, there's a few more lab studies and chemistry studies that EPA requires for registration and for experimental use permits. And so these include a GLP 5-batch preliminary analysis study, GLP pH and temperature stability study, as well as a 1-year storage stability corrosion study. And these will all be done by the National Wildlife Research Center's chemistry unit in the headquarters in Fort Collins. And we'll also have to contract out a few of the studies, which include the color, odor, physical state, and density studies. These will be at third-party organizations, which allows an unbiased process in registering this toxicant. And here's a picture of what the bait looks like. And so with all of those studies, we can then use that data to apply for our experimental use permit with the EPA, which is a required permit to test out this experimental bait in the field. And once we obtain that experimental use permit, we'll be able to put that toxicant, test it out, and that will be the toxicant, the exact formulation, which will be on the label for registration. We're going to use our bait station that we've modified that's working well in the field, and we'll be using different sites representative of the use pattern of registration. So these will include control and treatment areas, as well as different sites that have different humidity and environments, so we can have a good representative sample of the ecosystem. And we'll have to have free-ranging mongooses. This is an EPA requirement that we'll have to monitor individually. So we'll either radio tag or pit tag the mongooses, so we'll be able to track them in the field, and we'll be able to see if they're revisiting bait stations, as well as we'll be able to determine their fate after the treatments. We'll have to show that there's a high mortality of mongooses and low non-target interactions and low non-target mortality. We'll also be running transects in the treatment areas every day and collecting all carcasses that we find, which will then be sent to our chemistry unit in Fort Collins to look at diphacinone residues and then confirm cause of death. And if we meet all the EPA requirements and show that this toxicant is working well and is safe and is for the environment, then we'll be able to apply for registration of the toxicant. And ideally, we will have an EPA registration for a new, effective, and safe mongoose toxicant to be used nationally. So it'll be a Section 3 registration, and the use pattern will be terrestrial, outdoor, non-crop, bait station use only, and it will target US populations of mongooses in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and other US territories. And so currently, this is where our current step along this process. We just submitted our GLP lab efficacy study to our regulatory agencies, and now we're working on prototypes for bait stations. And I know I'm going to get the question of timeline. So here's a general, the years that we've done the work, as well as projected of time for the next steps along in the process. This is actually kind of an ambitious timeline because it takes in account the time to do this study, the time EPA needs to review our studies and EUP permit, as well as the registration review of that application, which can be 7 to 12 months. But by the end of this, we will have an effective toxicant that can be used for years and years, hopefully in Hawaii and in other places in the world. And so I have to give a huge mahalo to all of our supporters and funders for this work and research. The Hawaii Invasive Species Council has supported this research since 2018 to develop this important conservation tool that will be used for mongooses in areas that are vulnerable to invasion, like Hawaii, and also will help reduce mongoose populations in habitats that have our native nesting species. So thank you so much. If I have time for questions, I'm happy to answer. Also, I put my email out there for any questions you wanna email me. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, we have some time for questions, definitely. And we have one in from Patrick. This is great news. We really do need a new tool for removing mongooses. Are you finding that mongooses are killed with a single feeding, or does it need to be multiple feedings to be effective?
Yeah, so diphastenone is a first-generation anticoagulant, which ideally needs multiple feedings for it to be effective, and that's why it has a lower non-target risk for the same reason. But the good thing with the mongooses, there is a range of by individual, but they do have a very high, it is very toxic to them. And we've seen in the lab, if they've just eaten a couple grams of this bait, that they will succumb. But then certain mongoose need more. So there is a range. But the good thing is that this isn't the case for our native species. They would have needed multiple feedings. So yeah.
And I have a question. I imagine it's pretty hard to, I imagine anything that a mongoose can get into, a mouse or a rat could get into. So how do you reduce that rodent non-target?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's what we're thinking about right now when we're designing that bait station. And so, as you can imagine, the most obvious thing, mongoose are bigger than rats and mice. And so creating something that they can reach, but the mice and rats can't. And so that's why I said it has to be mongoose accessible, because we're going to trial out different engineering techniques that we're hoping the mongoose can grab the bait, but then the rats and the mice can't. So that's one way, is different engineering controls. Also, we've noticed in the past that different smells and pheromones will detract mice and rats. So because mongoose are a predator for them, so using the scent of a mongoose might deter them. So we're going to test out different things and hopefully find that perfect solution.
Wonderful. One of the funniest photos we have at Wildlife Services is a picture of a rat and a mongoose hanging out in a trap together, not
Oh
having any
no.
antagonistic relationship.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Usually the mice and rats would be freaked out, but I guess it just depends.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Okay, I'm gonna look for hands up. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Okay, well, thank you so much, Carmen. This was very interesting.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Gregory says, great work, Carmen.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so we do have a break period now, and we are a little ahead. So we have until 10:25 today. So yesterday we came back at 10:20, but today we are coming back at 10:25. So look forward to having you all back here and enjoy your break. Thank you.
They're like best friends.
Yeah, they're hanging out, definitely. Is Carmen still on? Yeah, she's still logged in, so hopefully she'll get to see it. So we got 2 minutes yet, but I'll leave this up until then.
Well, that's nuts. I've definitely trapped 2 mongoose in a cage before, but it was like a mom and a baby. I've never seen this.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of wild. Darren says the irony of it all is that we were really targeting cats with this trap. So, all right, welcome back, everyone. I've got up on my screen the photo I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to welcome our next speaker. So up next, we have our second theme highlight presentation. This year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that it would be downlisting or declassifying the Hawaiian stilt from endangered to threatened at the federal level. We have U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist Carrie Harrington. Carrie is the Candidate Conservation Program and Pre-Listing Coordinator and lead biologist for species reclassification. She's going to help us understand what happens when a species gets reclassified, how that occurred with the Hawaiian stilt, and what that means for the way we manage species. So welcome, Carrie. You can turn on your video and unmute, and we can get you sharing your screen. Okay, can you hear me, Carrie? We can't hear you. Okay, it looks like we might be having some technical difficulties. I'm going to ask to unmute. And Carrie, if you can hear me, one thing we can try is logging out and logging back in again. Okay, I am going to try to contact Carrie. And unless I hear something here, maybe we can go to our next speaker and get Carrie up afterwards. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. If you could just bear with us one moment. Bryce Inoye is our next speaker.
Oh,
Wait, there's Carrie. Yes, you did
yeah,
it.
I'm so sorry, you guys.
All right.
I thought it was on 1040. My apologies.
She just got on.
Yeah, I stepped away for a moment. My apologies. Okay, I'm starting now. Let me get here. 1 second.
Okay, hi Carrie, sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I apologize. So it looks like I did make a mistake. You are going on at 1040. I'm so sorry. Chad Wickham is our first speaker after the break. And he is scheduled at 10:25.
Oh, is he on?
He is.
Oh, okay.
I'm here.
That was my mistake. I was
Okay.
just looking at the wrong item, and no wonder you didn't answer. All right, I'm sorry, Carrie. So we'll have you stop sharing, and we'll have Chad up.
Yeah, I've got so many windows open.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm sorry.
Is it gone?
It is, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll mute now. Sorry,
Okay.
Chad.
No, I'm sorry, Chad, too. So, Chad, if you can unmute and start your video, I will give you your introduction. I again apologize for that. I was just looking at the wrong line.
Okay.
So
I was like, oh, I missed the memo too.
no, you're good. So Chad Wickham is a USDA wildlife biologist with Wildlife Services, and he is working on the Hokuala Nene hazing program. He is going to be giving us an update of this year's program, results, events, and changes. Thank you, Chad.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Screen share. Get this going. All right, how are we doing?
I can see.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you for having me present at this conference again. This is my second year presenting our project. So today I'm going to go over the 2 years of non-lethal hazing of Hawaiian geese using border collies on Kauai. Many of you are probably quite familiar with this project already. However, I'll do a brief overview of the project anyway. So our main species of concern is the Nae-Nae. It's endemic to the Hawaiian Islands. The Nae-Nae were hunted nearly to extinction. However, with intensive conservation efforts, their population is up, and they have been downlisted, as you mentioned earlier, federally, but I believe they're still endangered status statewide. But yeah, due to their increase in population, they are a concern for bird aircraft strike hazards. Additionally, I'm also monitoring other birds to be sure that we're not negatively impacting other T&E species, such as the Hawaiian stilts, the coots, ducks, and gallinus. I will have a full year of monitoring data by September. And to note as well, there are very few instances where any of these other species are involved in hazing events, so that's a bonus. So our project location is here at the Hokuala's Timber Resort, which is next to the Lihue Airport. on Kauai. And as you can see, that man-made lake area in the photo on the left is really the prime location that the birds like to congregate. That's hole 16, 17, 18 on the left side there. And you can see a couple of the islands. So the island, it's kind of in between the sand bunkers that you can kind of see. That was a really prime location for where we had nests this last season. The birds kind of figured out it was a little difficult for us to get onto the islands, and they definitely took advantage of that. So the objective of our study is to reduce and prevent Nae-Nae nesting on the resort property with a continuous non-lethal hazing program with the use of border collies as our primary tool. Another goal is to prevent birds and aircraft collisions, protecting the Nene and ensuring human safety. As you can see, the resort property is literally sandwiched in between those runways. The information obtained from this project will be useful in the development of a long-term plan to prevent Nene from nesting at the resort. And we began in the field at June 26th of 2019. So as Janelle mentioned earlier, we have updated our staff. So we started off with 2 complete dog teams, and many of you all have seen that famous picture of Caesar and Cliff and their dogs along the runway. So we recently added 2 more dogs and 2 more technicians. We have technicians in the field from before sunrise to after sunset. Therefore, we needed, in order to have coverage all year round, we really needed to expand our team. So the most common question I get, though, when I'm talking about this project with the public are the dogs catching the geese. People seem to think that we're just releasing these dogs haphazardly at the geese and let them chase the birds. We're working with T&E species, so we must be very careful in order to not cause harm and undue stress to the birds. So our dogs are trained to approach subject birds with commands from the handler. The hazing is done in a completely non-aggressive, slow, and steady manner, so no shouting or barking or chasing. I think many of you have seen Cliff and Caesar and Quinn and Quade quite a bit, so I kind of wanted to highlight a little bit of our new technicians and show you just a little bit of the training that we're done. So they went to North Carolina once travel was able to, and they trained for 2 weeks out there with their new dogs. And then they came out here for 2 more weeks to train with the dog handlers as well before they're able to go out into the field. So this is John and his dog Rowdy demonstrating some of the training. The dog is on a rope, and it's to prevent him from running off, and then so they can learn how to work together. You'll see in his hand, he's got a flag. He can use the flag to kind of direct the dog on which way he wants him to go. Let's see if this video will play. It's quite windy, so you might be able to hear him. So he was just kind of demonstrating some of the basic commands just to get the dog to go look for birds and making sure, you know, there's plenty of leash and the dog's not just running off and bolting and listening to all their commands. And once the tech feels comfortable working with their dog, then they can go off leash. So here we have Noelle and her dog Trim working off leash, and they're just kind of practicing keeping her dog on heel. Apologize for the wind again. It was beneficial for the airplanes, but not quite for my video. So as you can see, there's a bunch of egrets off there in the background, and Trim really pays them no attention at all. She's really staying focused on her handler. And this is really, yeah, they've only had the dogs for about 2 months, 2.5 months at this time, and they're very well trained. So in situations where the any dog team is unable to work on the property, I can take their place and use some other approaches to continue to haze the birds. We use the human approach, where we just walk up to the birds, a remote controlled boat, you can see on the bottom right. When the birds are in the water, so I don't have a dog to put them in, so I get the pleasure of chasing some birds with a boat, which is quite entertaining for me. And then our utility vehicle, which is a lot louder than the golf carts. So the birds have really figured out what our cart looks like and sounds like. So there's plenty of times where the birds will fly off before the dogs can even be released from their crate. And you can see right there, we got our spotting scopes. So once we got those, we're able to get more info and able to identify individual Nene a lot more easily. And we're figuring out which ones are frequenting the property and when. So I have a database that I'm working on of how many times each individual that has been identified has been hazed. So we can then know who are the problem birds that are continuing to come onto the property. Then those birds will be good candidates to put sat tags on when we're able to do more of that. So hopefully, well, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we haven't been able to do that. Dr. Brian Washburn has been able to get out here. So hopefully during this next molting season, when it's easy to get our hands on some birds, we'll be able to put some more sat tags on. So the main markers that for us to observe the number of hazing events and the total number of Nene being hazed. Here we have some data over the first 2 years of the project broken up by month. The number of hazing events and the number of Nene encounters decreased significantly over the first 5 weeks. However, due to the reproductive pressures and their desire to nest in the fall, both factors you can see decrease significantly during those times. And we don't haze goslings nor molted geese, or if there's a nest present. So those really decrease over time as the nesting season comes along. Once a nest is discovered, we leave that nesting pair alone. And so once the geese can fly off property, we see that they don't really return nearly as frequently during the spring and the summer months. During the second nesting season, fall of 2020 into 2021, we increased our efforts and time on the field. As you can see in the data, that these geese were quite persistent this year and attempting to nest on the property. So we went from the 2-dog teams the first nesting season, trying to cover every day, to adding myself and another technician without a dog for the second season, essentially doubling the amount of time covered in the field. So more time spent in the field equals more chances for hazing events. As you heard earlier, it was difficult getting the second set of dogs out here due to the pandemic. So we really adapted with what resources we had. In June of 2019, we only hazed over the 3 days. So July was really the first month that we can compare full months of data for 2019, 2020, and 2021. But even in June, you can see that there was just over those 3 days, there were more events than the 2 subsequent years. But in July, here we see that they have also decreased significantly for the entire month. And also staff Hokowal have mentioned that some of the tourists have been bummed that they're not seeing the Nene on property over the summer. So that illustrates that we've been having an impact and we're doing quite well with our efforts. They can go anywhere else off property to any other golf course and they'll definitely get to see some Nene. So we're excited to see how this next year's nesting season will go, as this is going to be a big test for us with the 4 full teams. And the geese should be pretty used to our presence on the property by now. I just wanted to highlight a little bit of other data that we're collecting. So we're making note of all the times of each hazing event. And this fluctuates throughout the year. So here I just have July pulled up. When I look at each individual month, I can really tell like what, when we're seeing the most birds. So during the summer, especially in July, is when we saw most of the birds really coming in at night. between 1700 and 2020 hours of the day. We really didn't see any midday, oh, I guess mid-morning. It seems like the birds are really just trying to use this property to overnight during the summer, and then they kind of fly off pretty easily when they see us. But this changes when you look at the overall hazing events over the 2 years. So during the mornings is kind of our most, when we'll see them, right at, between 5 to 8 a.m. And then also in the evening. So if you take the dusk and dawn times, that covers exactly 50% of the time when we're seeing the birds. So those are really our prime times when we need to be sure that we have the dog teams out in the field. And then we also look at the FID response, which is just like the direction of flight that the birds take during the hazing event. And this will also change and fluctuate throughout the year. So it's kind of nice to break it up by month and see what's going on each month. And so you can see for July of 2021, they flew west most of the time and then north, and the rest is kind of in order there on the right. This is really good information for DOFA to see, just so they can be aware, like estimate, where are the birds headed after they're being hazed. However, if you look at the overall data for the 2 years, most of the time they're just moving to another area on the property, which is 29%, and then south. So that really happens. It just shows like how stubborn they can be come nesting season. And when you saw, that's basically the majority of our events are during that time. And with only the 2 dog teams, when the dogs weren't present, when I was hazing in particular, they basically realized that I don't have a dog, I don't have something that can go chase them. So they're just going to hop over to the other side of the lake and, give me raspberries and just wait for me to go all around to the other side. So there were plenty of days where I was just basically moving the same birds around the property until they finally got sick and tired of me. I just want to also highlight a little bit of the nests and just even bring it back to many years ago before we started the project. So like in 2020 or 2012 and 2013, there were 89 nests. And between that 2012 and 2016, they were translocating Nene and seeing if that would help. And as you can see in 2015, 2016, it looked like moving the birds around really reduced the population, but then it, once we started, so this basically gives us a bar of what we're trying to beat. So we want to get these nesting numbers to single digits and ultimately, hopefully 0. I know that's going to be a really tough task. As you can see in 2019, 2020, 2020, 2021, there's still, roughly the same amount of nests. So this is going to be a really big goal for us this next year now that we're fully staffed, to really reduce that number and hopefully get into the single digits. All right, so other additional data that we collect, I was mentioned earlier, the GPS set tags that we get on the Nene, and that's really Dr. Brian Washburn's bread and butter. So if you have any questions about any of that, definitely direct that towards him. But here's some of what the data looks like for each month per individual. So this is a male who actually did nest on hole 16 on the property last season. So we see most of the time he's off the property, but he's still coming back on occasion. And it looks like he's using that area around hole 16, hole 17, and then the area that looks to be about where one of the irrigation ponds are. So those are really 2 main areas that we focus in and see where we should spend a lot of our time hazing. So I'd also like to thank a lot of our cooperators for this project. There's quite a few everyone working together. And additionally, as Darren mentioned earlier, I'd like to note again that this project, along with the Asian albatross relocation project on Kauai, won the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's 2021 Presidential Migratory Bird Stewardship Award. So just like give a big hats off to everyone that worked together to make this happen. It wasn't any one solo person's thing. There was a lot of boots on the ground and a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen. So it's really a full, team win, and I'm really proud and happy to be a part of that team. Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you all for your time and attention, and looking forward to the other presentations.
Thank you, Chad. We'll take any questions now. So again, you can raise your hand or use the Q&A or chat. Chad, the videos were coming in a little choppy, but I think we got the idea. So it would just kind of like, it would pause a little bit, so.
Okay, yeah.
It happens with slow internet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but that was, thank you so much for that information.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. All right, thanks, Chad. We're gonna go to our next speaker, which for sure this time is Carrie Harrington. So I gave her a full intro a little bit ago, so I'm gonna just do an abbreviated one here quick. So again, Carrie is the Candidate Conservation Program and Pre-Listing Coordinator and Lead Biologist for Species Reclassification. And she's gonna talk to us today about how the Hawaiian stilt is being reclassified.
Okay. Trying to turn on my camera. I don't know. So sorry. I seem so illiterate with this. Oh,
that's okay.
So here it is in the bottom. So sorry. We use Teams at the Fish and Wildlife Service. So
yeah.
It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. I think you need to unlock me too, or maybe. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go.
Got it? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Let me now share my screen. Okay. All right. Can you all see that now?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. So hi, my name is Carrie Harrington, and yes, I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So thank you for having me today. And I'm going to give you a brief overview because we have limited time, on the species reclassification process under the Endangered Species Act. And I'll be focusing on the IO because it is our most recent species proposed for reclassification, and actually only second to that of Nene. So under the Endangered Species Act, a species would warrant listing as threatened or endangered if it is threatened by one or more of 5 factors. And we call this, when we evaluate a species, the 5-factor analysis. And similarly, if we are going to reclassify a species or even delist it, we look at species condition through the lens of the 5 factors to see if the species conditions has improved or declined. And that could then warrant, a uplisting, say from threatened to endangered, or a reclassification from endangered to threatened if a species condition has improved over time. And more recently, the service has, attempted to refine this process by including something called the 3 R's. And that basically, maintains the 5-factor analysis, which is embedded in the ESA, but it takes those 5 factors and looks at the species or populations within, or populations of a species, resiliency for these populations to withstand a stochastic event, such as a botulism outbreak at a given wetland. Looking at the redundancy for the species as a whole, it's looking at populations spread out across the range of the species, or in the IO case, breeding populations, and the species as a whole, the redundancy of the species as a whole to withstand a catastrophic catastrophic event, such as a hurricane hitting an entire island. And the representation pertains to the healthy genetic diversity and or environmental diversity of the species across its range. And so we take all of this information and data working with species experts, and then after we compile it and put it together, we then look and say, okay, does this species meet the definition of endangered or threatened? And an endangered species is any species which is currently at risk of extinction. A threatened species is any species that is likely to become an endangered species or is likely to become, at risk of extinction in the foreseeable future. And the foreseeable future can even vary from species to species, depending on the available data and the life history of a given species. So looking at the regulatory history for IO, it starts back in 1970 when it was listed as endangered. And since then, there's been several recovery plans for the species and periodic assessments for that species to determine, have the conditions improved, have they declined, or does it remain the same? And all of the reviews recommended no change in status until 2020, when the species assessment, called a 5-year review, looked at the data and recommended that the species be reclassified from endangered to threatened. And so in 2021, the service published a proposed rule to reclassify the IO from endangered to threatened. And we recently just closed 2 public comment periods and held a public hearing. So a little bit about the species. This figure shows the counts from the summer and winter biannual state waterbird survey from 1986 to 2017. And the survey did take place before this, but it was standardized around 1986. And we do have some data from 2018 and 2019, but we don't have the complete data set yet, so we can't include that in our analysis at this time. So looking from 1986 to around 2000, you can see it was stable to increasing trend. And then when you see from around 2004 through 2017, the species stabilized above 1,500 birds. Species experts note, though, that these surveys are very valuable as an index of the population trend, but shouldn't be considered a true population estimate of the species surveyed for a number of reasons associated with the survey design. But also there's other factors, such as on a particularly rainy year, due to the fact that IO utilize ephemeral wetlands or even puddles, that if there's a particularly rainy year, they might be more widespread and therefore not at the wetlands that are included in the biannual count. And also, despite every effort made to survey the same wetlands each winter and each summer on a single day, sometimes it's spread over more than one day, or some wetlands are not included from year to year. But it still is the absolute best long-term data we have for the species. So just for those who aren't as familiar, I just wanted to give a couple pictures and a little bit about it. It's a very striking species, very conspicuous and easy to see. It's an endemic water bird with a lifespan of up to 30 or more years, and it is a conservation reliant species, which means it depends on management for its long-term survival. And its habitat requirements for nesting are quite specific, requiring mud flats, shallow water for the chicks, and vegetation for hiding from predators. But the outside of the nesting season, its foraging and loafing habitat is quite general, and it can be found at higher elevations in densely human populated areas, such as golf courses or at Kahului Beach. By buzzes you can see them frequently. But their nesting habitat is essential for many reasons I'll go into in a minute. And they also they occur across the main Hawaiian Islands except Po'olave. And they can move freely among wetlands, both intra-island and inter-island. So here, the state biannual waterbird survey includes 360 or more wetlands across the state. And you can see the red here denotes the various wetlands included in those surveys. The blue is the services, the Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetland Inventory, classified wetlands, which are available online. And now not all of those may necessarily align with IO's habitat needs. So the IO evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, yet it is preyed upon by mongooses, cats, dogs, rats, which eat eggs, chicks, and even adults at times. Habitat, as well as bullfrogs, cattle egrets, and even a couple of native birds. Habitat destruction or modification is also ongoing. I would say out of all of those listed here, sea level rise is definitely the gravest threat the species is facing. And then also environmental contaminants, as well as an increase in hurricane intensity and frequency resulting from climate change and avian diseases, primarily botulism. However, since 1970, there has been increasing conservation and management for the species. Predator is ongoing at most of the core wetlands and some of the supporting wetlands. Predator-proof fencing is increasing, so more and more wetlands are getting fencing. And then there's ongoing, other forms of management across the species range. And we are slowly, increasing the wetland restoration. I know currently our Coastal Partners program is working with partners on Molokai to restore some wetlands and maybe even on Oahu. So that is in the mix. There's also ongoing monitoring, and we partner with people and fund research. And then there's, of course, the state's biannual waterbird survey. So when you look at a recovery plan, this serves as a guide for the species recovery for both people in the Fish and Wildlife Service and our partners. And the most recent recovery plan for waterbirds and the IO focuses on the creation of a network of wetland complexes on each island aimed at providing the greatest potential recovery for the species. Core wetlands basically provide all of the nesting habitat for the species and are absolutely essential for the species survival, both currently and in the future. And the supporting wetlands, while also very important, maybe proportionally less value for the stilt, but they provide the stepping stones in between the core wetlands. And within the recovery plan, there's 4 criteria that are suggested as goal marks for reclassifying the species. But again, these are just a guide and not legally mandated. But criterion 1 says that all core wetlands should be protected and managed. Right now, we have 14 to 17 protected, and most of them have predator control and habitat management. Criterion 2 states that at least 50% of the supporting wetlands are protected and managed. This area, we do have a lot more work to do. Only 15 to 34 supporting wetlands are protected and only 7 have predator control. But most of these supporting wetlands are also more of mixed land ownership or private. And so, getting protection or, conservation for the species on these lands is going to require, more extensive efforts and collaborations with these landowners, so we need to build lasting positive partnerships with these landowners in order to, further recovery from the aspect of supporting wetlands. Criterion 3 states that there should be an updated population viability assessment. The last one was done in 1998. And that the statewide waterbird survey should show a stable or increasing population trend. And then that population doesn't decline below 2,000 birds, or the updated number from the new PVA for at least 5 consecutive years. So we have a draft PVA that is anticipated to be published in a peer-reviewed journal soon, but it shows that the population is likely at or near a carrying capacity with an estimated probability of extinction within 80 years of 0. And this is though under current conditions. It's important to keep in mind current conditions. They also found that the population begins to be regulated under density-dependent dynamics when the population exceeds 1,000 individuals. And so what this means is under current management, the statewide carrying capacity is below 2,000 individuals. So in order to increase this Iowa's population size, we need to increase our managed wetland habitat, creating more predator-free nesting habitat. Criterion 4 states that there should be multiple self-sustaining breeding populations on each of the main Hawaiian Islands. And while we still have more, further to go to reach this goal, the current distribution of the species is spread out across multiple islands, which gives the species the resiliency and redundancy necessary to withstand, stochastic and catastrophic events. But, looking at all the data and looking at our, the 5-factor analysis, the 3 R's, and the definitions of endangered and threatened, the service concluded that the conditions for the species have improved and the population is stable enough to where it is not currently at risk of extinction. Meaning, it doesn't meet the definition of endangered. However, due to the legacy stressors, especially looking at sea level rise, which is, we know it's going to increase over time, and that they occupy, all these low wetlands for their essential breeding habitat, the species does definitely meet the definition of a threatened species. And so we, propose to reclassify. But whenever you list a species as threatened, whether it be a newly listed species as threatened, or you're reclassifying from endangered to threatened, you have an option to include something called the 4D rule. And this is also outlined in Section 4 of the Endangered Species Act. And this only is available to species listed as threatened. And, the sole purpose of this is to be able to create regulations or exceptions thereof that are species specific, that will help further that species recovery. So it's geared towards, looking at a specific species. And I think working with people, we met with, nearly 40 partners. We're trying to ask people what would help, what would help further the recovery of this species? What would help you? And we did entertain a lot of things to include in this. And what we did decide is that due to the legacy threats and the conservation reliant nature of the species, that we would we would retain all the prohibitions afforded to an endangered species. So, some people worry that with the change of, reclassification, it has less protection or may get less funding, but we essentially are giving all the same protections, except we did have a couple exceptions, some of which are embedded in the Act, even given to all endangered species, such as authorized by permit or, in situations where there's an emergency. But what we did is, after talking with myriad partners, we found that if we could make an exception for incidental take to an otherwise lawful activity caused by habitat management or predator control, that could actually help further the recovery of the species. And of course, we also included law enforcement in that, which can help for several reasons. But so the intent of this is to provide a benefit to our valuable conservation partners, so they can hopefully focus more on habitat management and predator control rather than on the regulatory nature to implement those. So that state, as Chad pointed out, this species will still be at this time listed as endangered by the state. And there is no exception for these activities under state law. So it's, the state, people will need to go to the state for a permit, but if it's only impacting IO, they would not need to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or, get a permit from us. And it's similar for how the Nene, due to, especially on Kauai, the nature of that, the intent was to help, multiple partners, help more safely manage the species. So we had the 4D rule actually has a lot of benefits, and, if you use it right. And so I think with that, I would like to just open the floor to questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Carrie. I'll give some time for people to type in questions. That was very, very interesting. I know one of the things that we get asked a lot is, after that reclassification, what are the changes to management? And we always say that really there's no change in how we can manage between a threatened and an endangered species. Do you have more to add to that or can clarify that?
Well, unlike the Nene, which, hazing there was an exception for hazing in, for a more broad range of partners. We have, the IO is a little bit more limited in scope. So I don't anticipate anything changing for any HCP or, anyone that isn't solely focused on a conservation effort for the IO. And that is because, the threats that are on the, affecting the species and anticipated to become more like, we're not sure, we're still looking at models and figuring out, what wetlands are going to be completely inundated, where they might expand to. Is a possibility to, help with adapting areas to make suitable habitat in newer wetland areas. And it gets very complex. And so we just, but we did entertain more. Like I worked with Darren Phelps for a while, looking at a potential exception for maybe just a training class, a little certificate for hazing for construction sites or things like that. Because we don't want them nesting, if there's a rain and, someone clears an area and there's a puddle forms because of an overnight rain and you get a nest. We don't want that, right? We want them nesting in the safe, protected core wetlands. But, by the time we got to the headquarters in DC, that was omitted from the rule just because they thought that it was, a bit cumbersome and it would just be better to have folks get a permit for certain activities. So, there's a lot of say in these rules. A lot of different people have, different perspectives. It goes through a lot of review.
I don't know if, oh, okay. I thought we lost your audio for a second because the sound cut off abruptly, but I think you're done speaking. So one comment, it's not like a question, but it's a comment from Chad. I'm seeing more IO at Hokuala this summer than last year. Things do seem to be moving in a positive direction for their population. So I think in general, most of us have seen quite a few IO recently.
Yeah, it does appear to be like the most adaptable of the water birds. I mean, it's, yeah, it's a really interesting species.
Wonderful. I'm not seeing any more questions or hands raised. So thank you so much, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you. Aloha. I'll mute myself now and turn off my camera.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Bryce Inoue. He is the current Oahu's Assistant District Supervisor. He is going to give us an overview of the Kehi Lagoon Mangrove Removal Project, which has been a long time in the making and was near completion this year. So welcome, Bryce. Bryce is going to be using my computer, so I'm going to set him up here. You don't have any video or audio, do you?
There's a video.
Okay. You should be good to go, and then you can just use the arrows to advance.
Oh, that's myself. All right, thank you, Janelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Bryce Inoue. I am the Assistant District Supervisor, Supervisory Wildlife Biologist for Oahu, for USDA Wildlife Services. And today I will be talking about the Kehi Lagoon Mangrove and Cattle Removal Project. So some background on this project, like Janelle stated, it has been ongoing for a while now, but I do have some excerpts from a couple of reports back in 2010, July 2010, where a second path was cut through the mangroves of Kehi Lagoon, connected to the original path, which was cut during the first phase. So that was back in July 2010. Was that 11 years ago? The first path was actually cut in February 2008. So it goes back to 2008. I also wanted to put in that the March 2011 report states that 300 cattle egrets were dispersed and 25 were killed. That one is quite a monumental thing for us because that was actually the first shoot conducted with a boat that Wildlife Services had purchased. But that was 11 or so years ago. So it's been a long time in the making. But the problem that we wanted to address was that there was a large egret roost in the Kehi Lagoon mangroves. Now these birds, due to their size and their flock size, pose bird strike hazards and risks to Daniel K. Inouye International Airport. These are a few photos of the size and quantity of these birds, especially the bottom right photo. Now that's a flock, if you want to call it that, definitely a large group of egrets flying to the mangroves, most likely to nest for the night. Roost for the night. The solution that was decided upon was regularly occurring harassment, hazing, and lethal control of cattle egret on and around the airport. Now these are opportunistic harassments that occur daily, and we combine that with first removing cattle egret shelter in the mangrove, lethally removing roosting and nesting cattle egrets currently in the mangrove, and then finally regular cutting of the mangrove to remove the habitat from the area. Now, this was a very big project that created a lot of collaborations between many different entities. And the challenges that we faced, we need to address them in order to ensure the ongoing success to achieve the desired result, which was to prevent any more or to mitigate strike hazards to our airports. Challenges we encountered were homeless individuals and squatters, a lot of scheduling. We had to deal with nature, tides, weather, and of course, COVID-19. So the squatters throughout the lagoon islands, the mangrove islands, was quite extensive. The photo that you see on the screen, all of the red areas were actually areas where there were potential encampments and or individuals full-time on the island. There was a 2-story home and boat landing on the Moanalua Islands in the center of your screen, as well as another boat landing and encampment on the lower island. So, of course, it was a large and widespread community, if you want to call it that. So, Hawaii Department of Transportation, Air Force Division, they work very closely with many different entities, including the city and county, the government, governor's office, homeless advocate, also with dealing on dole care, harbor sheriffs, harbor police, airport sheriffs, airport security, contracted barges and boats to not only remove the homeless and the squatters, but also all of their belongings and equipment that they had and store them off site. Now these squatters, they posed a very safety risk, a very high safety risk. Not only the mangrove removal, with all the heavy equipment and long hours of that kind of work, but also with our work, wildlife services work, with the removal of cattle egrets due to our usage of firearms on this project. So it was very important. We need to get them into a safe area that they wouldn't pose a safety risk to us, and we wouldn't pose a safety risk for them. So undertaking that was a great success for us, everyone involved in this project. The tides. So nature has its way with us. We can't control it, so we have to adapt to it. The mangroves were only able to be accessed by boat at low tide events. We needed to be able to walk on the exposed areas of the mangrove in order to get to areas where the egrets were nesting and roosting. All of the highlighted yellow, all the tide events highlighted yellow were low tide events occurring at night. And then all of the highlighted events in blue are low tide events occurring during the day. When the tides favored day shooting, we struggled with the public, canoe clubs, hydrofoil surfers, kayakers, anyone using the area for recreation. And all we could do was alert them that we were in the area and that we would be holding off and standing by as they did their business. And once they moved to a safe distance, we conducted our work. If we noticed that they were coming back or more people were utilizing the area, we ceased operations, and we were at the whim of the public during those day events. Now at night, low tide events at night, again, navigating in the dark was a challenge to begin with. And as the mangrove project moved forward and more mangroves were actually removed, that gave us less and less visual reference points to know where we could go and where the boat would be in much too shallow water and get stranded. So a lot of time and effort went into figuring out the perfect time to conduct these shoots in terms of when we could get out there with the boat. Again, nature, weather, we can't control it. High winds and rain proved to be situations in which we couldn't always foresee but we tried to as best as we could. We used a small boat for this project. It's not the exact boat in this photo, but it's the same model, 15-foot Boston whaler, 150 Montauk, for any of you out there who are into boats. It is a whaler. But fitting the necessary 3 to 5 people in this boat, it didn't leave a lot of room for error in terms of weight distribution, as well as social distancing. So in addition to coordinating control work with the tides, we need to make sure that there were no high winds. High winds can lead to choppy water conditions. And if weight distribution was not estimated correctly or even off by a little bit with 3 to 5 people in the boat, it could lead to dangerous situations, which of course we wanted to avoid. Rain was another natural occurrence that we needed to predict for, because as the rain gets harder and harder, visibility decreases. And this is not only an issue for navigating the boat, but also our control work. When we are conducting our shoots, we want to know not only where our target was, but also what is in front of our target, as well as, most importantly, anything behind our target. And then if we can't safely and accurately conduct our work in that way, then we needed to hold off on conducting the shoot. Navigating the boat was also hard. Wildlife service specialists were working in the mangroves during low tide through sharp brush, deep mud, and knee-high water at times, and the rain didn't make safety any easier to achieve. And COVID. As much as COVID has affected us in many different ways in the past couple of years, it also affected this project. Socially distancing in the boat was hard in order to make sure all of our specialists and everyone involved were a safe distance from each other to keep them safe. As well as during this time, there was less vehicle and airfield traffic. Now, with that lessened activity, the firearms noises were able to echo farther and sound traveled farther during these times because they weren't drowned out by the other noises. So we were restricted to the use of air rifles, and air rifles were much more susceptible to high winds, and making accuracy was very hard to achieve at longer distances. So we need to get closer and closer and closer to the birds before actually conducting the work. But through all that, we did achieve some results and some levels of success. I'd say very high levels of success, which I'm going to go through in the following slides. So the mangrove removal, it started off, as you can see in these photos, the brush and as much as the clippings and everything removed were everything cut were put into these bags and then removed at a later time. The next, I'm hoping that you guys can see this video, but this video will show you the extent of just one area, one lagoon island in which the mangroves were removed. So. Hopefully that played for everybody. But the extent of the mangroves were, extensive. As you can see, that the original mangroves there were, they're 10, 20 feet high and very hard to access. So to remove them it was a big project to get all the heavy equipment out there, including the removal of everything clipped and cut. The conditions were, of course, sharp branches, knee-high water, mud. But in the end, these are the 2020 photos of the same areas where the mangroves were, and you can barely see anything. There's nothing above, maybe above the horizon anyway. So with that removal of the habitat, we're also going to look into the removal of cattle egrets. So these are our egret removal totals. We started our first shoot in 2020 during March, concluded in June of 2020. These control work events, these shoots were scheduled concurrently. So, a portion of the mangroves we cut, we would then go in and provide control work of the egrets to follow. Specialists were able to conduct 12 total site visits from March to June, removing 2,392 cattle egret individuals. 126 nests were removed, as well as 244 eggs were removed. So the totals were, they provided a good estimate of not only what was there before, but how much we may have in the future. But we also had census data, excuse me, of prior years. So, sorry, 2018 of April, this was very close to the time in which those photos were taken in the beginning, where all the egrets were transiting to the mangroves. And as you can see, in April in 2018, 36 cattle egret were observed during that monthly census, along with 68 cattle egret observed during May of 2018. Closer to the actual shoots that were conducted in 2020, 55 cattle egrets were observed in February of 2020. And then right in June of 2020, 59 cattle egret were observed. And these are morning, midday, and evening surveys. June of 2020, that was kind of going over to the last shoot. However, post mangrove removal, as well as after the last shoot, July of 2020, 0 cattle egret were observed during our monthly census. In August of 2020, 2 months after the conclusion of our shoot, 1 cattle egret was observed. So short-term cattle egret populations or cattle egret observations were low to none. However, as we move into 6 months after June of 2020, during December, the cattle egrets were coming back. More and more cattle egrets were being observed. So as these regular random shoots and disturbances were not occurring as much, it gave these birds a chance to not only recover and recover their population, but their habitat. But in general, animals, they find a way to adapt, and it forces us as wildlife services specialists to adapt as well. And that starts with continued observations through time. As more of those mangroves were removed, they provided less and less habitat for cattle egrets to nest and roost. But new cattle egret locations were observed very close to the original location of the mangrove removal. They still pose a hazard to the airport, as the egret transit routes may intersect with H&L flight patterns. Navy Marine Golf Course, Honolulu Country Club, Hickam Golf Course, as well as Sand Island are all in that vicinity. So while we will need to be continually observing where these birds are going, as well as if they pose any greater risks to our airports. The mangrove removal has been a great success for wildlife services down Kehi International Airport for mitigating bird strike risks and hazards. But as we know, nature doesn't stop. If it did, our jobs would all be a lot easier. But with continued observations and monitoring daily, we'll know, and we'll always be able to adapt to the situation. But aside from that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone involved with this project, all of our collaborators and everyone who coordinated and helped out with this project. So thank you very much. I think
if you hover on the top, there should be a stop sharing button that pops up. Oh, it's on the other screen. See the red?
Okay. Stop sharing.
And now you should be able to see chat and Q&A, and you can respond to those questions.
So I will be, if there's any questions, I'll be answering them now. Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah. Tim, I will go ahead and respond to your question. Can you say something about the future? Mangrove Islands to ensure mangroves don't just come back. Yes. We are going to continue to work with HDOT with scheduling of any more cuts, as well as our control work over time. As of right now, I don't personally know of any more events that are going to occur in terms of cutting or mangrove removal or even our control work. But perhaps I can, I'll check with John and go talk to the other technicians as well as HDOT to see if there's any plans in the future. To Steve, I do not know the anticipated grow back rate of the mangroves that were removed. I can look into the average growth rate to see how quickly or how slowly they grow back, and through that we can schedule, if needed, more mangrove removal projects. Okay. I think that's all for me. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. I will hand it back to Janelle.
Hey, thank you so much, Bryce. That was wonderful. Wonderful to see that project being completed. Fiddling with my screen here for a second. Okay, and we are a little behind schedule, so I apologize, but we have one final speaker, last but not least, Brian Washburn. Dr. Brian Washburn is a wildlife researcher with Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center. Brian is an accomplished researcher and has also served as adjunct professor at both Michigan State and the University of Missouri. He has worked closely with us on several projects in Hawaii, including the Hokuala Nene program and the Albatross Translocation program at PMRF. Today, he's going to give us his experience and expertise in managing airport vegetation to reduce wildlife strike hazards. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Janelle. Trying to get my presentation on. Hopefully that you can see the slides. Before I get started, I do want to wish a warm aloha to all my friends and colleagues in Hawaii, from my island, Katawa Island here in Lake Erie, to you. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe in these challenging times. I am quite ready for them to be over, and I look forward to soon getting back to Hawaii and working on our projects. As Janelle mentioned, we've got some more tags to put out on Nene, and looking forward to doing that. But today I did want to talk about an area of research that I used to do quite a bit of, and that is how we manage airfield vegetation in efforts to reduce strike hazards. And so just in terms of background, one thing I do like to talk about when talking about this particular topic is, for those of us who are trained in traditional wildlife management, we're trained with this goal in mind. We want to provide areas that meet the needs, albeit food, cover, water, for one or more species of wildlife. This is what most of our colleagues do in regard to meeting the needs of wildlife, that we want abundance and we want things. However, when we work in the wildlife damage management realm, in this conflict realm, particularly at airports, we want to do just the opposite. We want to make these airfield areas just as unattractive to hazardous species as we can. So very often what we try to do is take what we learned about enhancing habitat, and we try to do the opposite. We try to make it as unattractive to these species as we can for the benefit of people and for the benefit of the wildlife themselves. So in thinking about this, when I often think of vegetation or plant management as it relates to airports, there's 3 areas that we've historically done research in, or we think about, or another way to think of it is these are 3 areas we have some influence on. The first is vegetation height. So how tall is the vegetation on the airfield, how dense it is. We certainly can manage that, and there's been some research into that realm, which I'll talk about. The second area where I work quite a bit in is the plant community composition. So what kinds of plants make up the airfield vegetation? What kind of plants do we have out on the airfield or our surrounding areas? And then thirdly, when we're renovating or we're reseeding areas, we do construction, we want to reseed areas, we have an opportunity to drive, in particular, this plant community composition. So we have a chance to put back plants that we would like to see on the airfield, serve certain needs, and again, in the best case scenario, minimizing attractiveness to hazardous wildlife or the species we're concerned about. So that's kind of generically what I want to talk about today. When we think about vegetation on an airfield, at least when I think of it, here we have some taller grass. It's mixed with forbs. And this provides, one, good cover for wildlife or birds and mammals that we might be attracted to it, to feed in, to hide in. For example, it may have a lot of grasshoppers in it, which are really attractive to a lot of species of birds, and provide a great protein source, food source, as do beetles and insects and things. And then the plants themselves may serve as an attractant. They might be the food source that the wildlife is interested in. So as we think about this, if we were benefiting the wildlife, or we really wanted to do that, that was our main goal. We'd want to provide this food and cover. We're trying not to do that. So one of the main ways we have to do that is through mechanical means. We mow the airfield vegetation. That reduces it down. When there's less vegetation, there's less cover, places for animals to hide in. There's less food. And ultimately, there's likely less insects because you have less vegetation cover there. So, across airports and military air bases, there is a lot of mowing that goes on. This is one of the primary means, if not the primary means, we have to manage vegetation on airfields. Another area which we did some research in involves the use of chemicals. In this case, herbicides or plant growth regulators. So herbicides obviously remove plants or kinds of plants, depending on the herbicide, out of that plant community. Plant growth regulators actually control the growth of the plants. So they're used commonly on golf courses and residential areas and industrial areas. And they have these benefits and they just slow the grass or the vegetation down from growing quite fast. You don't have to mow as much. And this may have some advantages within airport environments. So in order to look at this, and this was a number of years ago when I first started with the National Wildlife Research Center in Ohio, we did an experiment, colleagues and I, where we have on the NASA facility where we work, we had 12 areas that we call our simulated airport environment. So they're within the NASA research facility we're on. It's not actually on an airport, but we try to manage them just like it is. And it provides us a safe place to do research and look at things. If we were to increase the hazard or the use of hazardous birds of an area, we're not increasing or decreasing safety that way. So it's a great place to learn and start out before we take it to the airfields themselves. So we conducted a study. We had 4 plots that we just left alone, if you will, kind of like you see in the background of this photo. So the vegetation just grew up as it normally would. We had 4 plots that we mowed when they reached a certain height, actually about 8 inches. We would mow them off to about 6 inches, and we tried to maintain that height throughout a growing season. And then the third, we applied a mixture of 2 chemicals, one acting as a plant growth regulator. We wanted to slow down the growth of the grass. And then 2, we used a forb-specific herbicide, which we were interested in taking out the clover and some of the other broadleaf plants that were in this plant community to see what the effect might be on the wildlife that would use them. Can we change the plant community and get an effect that we're interested in, make it less attractive, if you will? So just quickly looking at the results, what we saw here, the red bars here on the left are the plots we just mowed them. The ones in the yellow in the middle are where we mowed them. We applied the chemical. And then later in the growing season, we did have to mow them again. The growth regulators did keep the vegetation down, at least some kinds of grass, but some others kept growing. So it wasn't quite as effective as we had hoped, but it was effective. And then on the right, you can see was these unmanaged control plots. And what we see is across the season on average per survey, we saw twice as many birds of different kinds of birds in the control areas. So what we're seeing, as we have in other studies, is if you keep the grass shorter in the 6 to 8 inch realm, at least in our case, and on some airports actually, you get less bird use, if you will. So that was important. Another thing that was very interesting to us is when we got done doing our point count surveys, counting the birds in these plots, we sent 2 people to walk through them, and we flushed up birds that we didn't see and we didn't count because they were basically hiding in the vegetation. And you see there were a couple of them on average now and then in the mowed plots or the mowed and chemical plots. But in that control plot, there was another on average 2.5 or more birds for each count that we did. So in reality, there were a lot more birds in that area where we didn't manage the vegetation, even more than we counted, because they were doing a great job of hiding in the vegetation. So this is really important when we're thinking about airfields. Granted, Ohio is a different plant community, climate, and everything from Hawaii, but the concept is there. If you have this taller vegetation, animals have a better chance of hiding in it, and you have less chance of detecting them and hazing them off, scaring them away. So this is one of the issues with vegetation height. Henceforth, depending on the situation, unless you have birds that really like the short grass, it's likely in general a better way to go. But you want to kind of figure that out for your specific situation. Another thing that's very important in all this, and this has been, we saw this in our study, some other studies, and we see it in field studies at actual airports too. This act of mowing the vegetation, keeping it short, maybe compacting the ground a little bit. What we see is we really didn't catch any mice, rats, voles, things, small animals or mammals that were in these plots where they were managed and were mowing. They just weren't there. And we contrast that to those control plots. There was actually quite a few in there. So this is good from a standpoint for those birds, mostly we're talking about, or maybe we're talking about coyotes or foxes or other things, at least on the mainland, that are attracted to these areas, are coming to feed on these little critters. The mowing and this vegetation management actually kind of not got rid of them, but it encouraged them elsewhere. So that was real important too, particularly if you have those types of species. So thinking about Hawaii airfields, the cattle egrets and some of the others preying on insects, they happily prey on some small mammals too. So managing that vegetation provides some benefits in reducing the attractiveness. So looking more into the airfield plant community composition. So what kind of plants do we have out on the airfield? What kind of plants would we like out on the airfield? And so forth. We can manage these plant communities and get them towards something like what we're looking for. And when we're talking about managing plants out on airfields, we ask a lot out of this. So particularly around the runways, in the safety areas and things, there's some special requirements beyond just the wildlife side. So when we're looking for vegetation that we might plant in a reseeding or encourage as we're managing vegetation, first of all, we want something inexpensive. We want it to be cheap. We don't want to spend a lot of money. We want it to be available and something we could reseed if we needed seeds. We want it to be easy to establish and manage. We don't want to spend a lot of money in extra chemicals and things like that. We want it to be simple. We want a low, thick growth form that tends to help cover the ground, if you will. And if it's shorter, all the better, less mowing. It needs to be non-flammable. So should there unfortunately be an incident, pyrotechnics, starting a fire or something, you know, we look to this vegetation not to start a big grass fire, if possible. And it's got to tolerate vehicle traffic. There could be aircraft, unfortunately, exiting the runways. You could have ARF vehicles and all kinds of things going on. So it's got to be tolerant to that as well. We can't have vehicles getting stuck. And then also, we want it to look nice. We want it to be aesthetically pleasing. When people come and land, years ago, I was talking to the folks at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, Arizona. Here in the desert, they were growing grass around parts of their airfield and spending a lot of money doing that. And I was talking to them about that, and it was really interesting. They wanted the perception when people come, they land at that airport, they want to be the oasis in the desert. So they want their vegetation looking really nice. And we all want that. When we land somewhere, we want the stakeholders, the people traveling to like what they see. And then lastly, on top of all this, we don't want to attract hazardous wildlife while we're at it. So we do ask a lot out of the vegetation. It's challenging to find ones that we really favor in this. Bryce just gave a great example of specific vegetation attracting hazardous wildlife off the airfield. Those mangrove swamps are providing the roost shelter for the cattle egrets, probably some food too. And therefore, when they were removed, we removed the attractiveness. Another example of this is bayberries that were on the John F. Kennedy Airport. There were a lot of strikes with these tree swallows, smaller birds, but yet a lot of strikes. And it was figured out that these bayberry plants were out on the airfield. They were producing fruit that was attracting the tree swallows in the summer. So when we're thinking about airfield vegetation and things we don't want there, we don't want or try not to have vegetation that's producing fruit or nuts or things that are attracting the wildlife. Elsewhere is great. We want them in our yards and we want them other places. We don't want them on our airports. So if we can reduce this attractant where it occurs, that's to our benefit in our management. And then lastly, an area that I've spent a lot of time researching and working on, particularly with this species, the Canada goose, so the Nene-Nae's cousin, here on the mainland. This is a big issue for our airports on the mainland, and it parallels the Nene-Nae issue very well because these geese, like the Nene-Nae, like open grassy areas, and they like to go to airports to feed because there's often water and there's kinds of grass that they might like to feed on. Same with golf courses. So many years ago when I first started, we did a study, a pen study. So we got some geese and we put them in a pen and we gave them two choices. There was a tall fescue grass, which is a cool season grass we have here, mostly on the mainland, came from Europe many years ago. And then Also, we offered them perennial ryegrass, which is a very similar grass, another cool season grass. We let the geese go into their pens, and then counted where would they eat, where would they want to go. They avoided this tall fescue grass. Without going into my PhD dissertation and many years of research, turns out there's a kind of fungus that lives in this tall fescue grass that makes it taste bad to the geese and other animals like cattle and things, and it makes them feel sick. So they tend to avoid eating it, which turns out to be a great thing when we're looking for vegetation we would want to put on a place where we didn't want the geese to be. So we had an option now for at least parts of the mainland, but then we wanted to take that further. So we started to think about the other turf grass types that we have here on the mainland that are used in turf grass areas, airports, lawns, and other places. So we tested a variety of turf grass types that we have. There's this fine fescue mix, which is related to the other tall fescue. It just doesn't have the same fungus in it. Zoysia grass, also known as Korean longgrass, is more of a temperate or even subtropical grass. St. Augustine, very much a subtropical grass found in Florida, here on the mainland. And then centipede grass, which is another subtropical grass found in southern parts of the US, used in turf grass situations. And we tested some other grasses as well. And again, we got our geese and we actually got turf brought into our facility, and then we would let the geese out. And where do they want to go eat? Well, it turns out they'll go sit and they'll loaf and they'll sleep on anywhere they want. They really don't pay too much attention. But when they went to go to eat, they made some very selective choices. And this sort of summarizes what those choices were. What we saw was when the time came, if you gave them the choice, they would want to eat Kentucky bluegrass or creeping bentgrass. They were okay with Bermuda grass and buffalo grass, if it wasn't their favorite, but they would certainly, to a degree, go eat it. Tall fescue, same idea. They tended to avoid it, maybe eat on it a little bit. What's interesting is when you compare it to just bare ground or just dead grass, they simply avoided feeding on the zoysia grass, the Korean long grass, the centipede grass, or the St. Augustine grass. So what we're seeing is the geese were selecting the grasses they wanted to eat, the ones they were avoiding. And incidentally, we did some more research trying to figure out what was driving these decisions. And it turns out it's protein levels in the grass. The geese were making nutritional choices in picking out those that had really high protein levels. So for the situation of Hawaii, if these grasses are used in lawns and things, if they're not there already, because the last thing you poor folks need is more species brought into the state. But if indeed they are used in those situations, they might be good choices or something similar to use at Lihue, to use in golf courses in different places where we really would like the Nene not to come feed. We don't want to be attracted to it. So certainly there's some work that could be done to that effect. And these grasses also take a lot of management. You can mow them down, they do fine, which helps in that height management as well. So last, just to kind of summarize up some of this, at least these concepts, managing air vegetation is indeed very challenging. You don't want to mow it too short. If you end up with bare spots, doves and things like that. We just there's a no win at the end of the day, right? There's always something that's happy about or attracted to what we have, but there's definitely challenges, and there's some things we can do. Whether we're doing it with mechanical means, we're doing it with chemical, removing the plants that we know are attractive to the hazardous wildlife we're concerned about specifically is a fundamentally overall great thing we can do to reduce the attractiveness of airfields. And that's very site specific. It's very species specific, but if we're good biologists and we're paying attention and we're understanding, we could have a lot of benefits there, i.e. just like the mangroves. And then lastly, when we're reseeding airfields or other areas, we want to be careful, pick the seeds and plants that wildlife really don't prefer and try to avoid those that they do prefer if we have this information. So we can create the poor habitat that we really want on airfields. So with that, I'll kind of wrap things up. Here's my email, my cell. Certainly, if anybody has any questions about this, about the Albatross project and any project or anything else you would like to talk about, please feel free to contact me at any time. And I genuinely look forward to, hopefully in the near future, actually being able to see everybody in person again and have some great discussions that way. Computers are fine, but it's not nearly as fun as seeing everybody in person. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We have a few minutes for questions if we have any. So again, chat box or raise your hand. I think that last experiment you talked about with the Canada geese was really interesting, with a clear selection only when they're eating.
It makes a lot of sense too, at least in our part of the world. Golf courses typically use creeping bentgrass in the putting greens, and they use Kentucky bluegrass on the fairways. Combine that with water hazards, and you got the perfect place for Canada geese. Henceforth, they love golf courses.
Yep. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
I think everybody's ready for lunch.
Yeah, it is getting to that time. So thank you so much, Brian. That was wonderful.
My pleasure.
All right. So we are going to wrap up. This has been a great 2 days, great presentations. Thank you so much again to HDOT, Ross Higashi, Chief Jacobs, Darren Phelps from Wildlife Services, all the presenters, Kyan Lewis, our wonderful IT specialist. And then especially I want to thank, all the people at the airport. So all the wildlife services specialists, all the airport managers and ramp personnel and AOCs, who are out there actually doing this work. Thank you so much. Some questions have come up about recordings. So we are recording this and we will make recordings available. Saw some chat coming in. Does Chief Jacobs or Darren, do you have any closing words?
Well, I didn't have a closing word just yet. I wanted to ask you, how do you folks address the various types of grass and the mowing at Hawaii airports? That's what Brian was saying. I thought that was very interesting. Whereas in Hawaii, and I think I was with you guys on a trip with Darren, where they say the Nene like the really short type of grass, and there's a different type of grass. Like we don't have Nene on Oahu, thank God, but maybe in Maui. How do you folks address that?
Well, the main way we address the habitat is through our recommendations in the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan. So Wildlife Services in general does the control work, the hazing work, and then we make recommendations to the airport, the maintenance to manage the habitat, to do the mowing. So we recommend mowing schedules. And if there's new projects or construction, we recommend grass species. With the upcoming construction at H&L, we have recommendations for grass species and then also how to plant those species. So seeding can often provide some attraction while you're seeding because it's often an area is overseeded. So we've had some recommendations there for alternatives. I would love it if we had maybe John in here. I'm seeing if he's in here to add some things about that. So the primary way we address grass is through the habitat recommendations that the airport then implements. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, good.
But I want to thank all the, this is the second year we did virtual. And so I think virtual is good because our speakers can't get away. It doesn't cost money now to travel. So that's a good thing about virtual, but I do miss the interaction with the speakers. And I want to thank the FAA for their continued participation. And most of all, USDA and their hard work and their technicians in the field. I hope to get over to Kauai to meet the 4 dogs and handlers over there. Because that's a long time coming to get that program going. And I hope you folks keep promoting that project because it's a long time coming, and the thing is now the sustainability of it. And I thank you very much for your organization and for all the participants that are on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Jacobs. All
Hi,
right.
Janelle.
Oh, go
Darren.
ahead, Darren.
I just wanted to thank all our colleagues and anybody else still on the line in the mainland. I know it's later in the day, especially if people are on the East Coast. We really appreciate you all staying on as long as you can, and hope to see you all in the future. Thanks, Janelle, back to you.
Thank you. Well, I don't have anything further to add. Just really excited that, you all came and, enjoyed this with us and learned some things. So have a good rest of your day, and we will see you next year. Aloha.